Picture this, if you will. The sun is setting over the 7 hills of Rome, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the distant murmur of a crowd. Suddenly, the sound of sistrums, those sacred rattles, cuts through the evening. A rhythmic, metallic whisper that seems to call from another world. A procession emerges, a river of white-robed figures moving with an otherworldly grace. At their center, carried high upon the shoulders of devotees, is a statue of a goddess, her head crowned with a throne, a serene and powerful gaze etched upon her face. This is Isis, the Egyptian mother goddess, and her worshippers are not in the land of the pharaohs, but in the very heart of the Roman Empire. This scene wasn't a strange anomaly. For centuries, it was a powerful, mysterious, and at times forbidden, part of Roman life. What you are about to witness is a story largely untold, a secret history buried under layers of imperial propaganda and centuries of dust. This is the story of how an ancient Egyptian deity captured the soul of Rome, promising salvation, wielding immense political power, and challenging the very foundations of the Roman state. We are about to pull back the curtain on one of history's most fascinating spiritual revolutions. To understand the sheer power of this cult, you have to grasp the world it invaded. Rome was a society built on order, discipline, and a pantheon of gods who often seemed as bureaucratic and distant as the Senate itself. Jupiter, Mars, Minerva, they were figures of state power, patrons of conquest and civic duty. They demanded sacrifice, but did they offer personal comfort? Did they speak to the longing in the human heart for a direct, transformative connection with the divine? This was the spiritual vacuum that the cult of Isis so masterfully filled. It wasn't just another foreign superstition. It was a complete spiritual package. It offered pageantry, mystery, and most importantly, a promise of personal salvation, of triumph over death itself, available to anyone who sought her grace, from the highest senator to the lowest slave. This was a radically inclusive idea, in a brutally hierarchical world. So how did this happen? How did a goddess from a conquered land not only find a home within the empire that defeated her people, but rise to such prominence that emperors feared her and common people adored her? The journey of the cult of Isis through the back alleys and grand temples of Rome is a tale of intrigue, persecution, and ultimate, stunning resilience. It's a story that reveals a hidden layer of the ancient world, a spiritual underworld that flourished in the shadows, offering a different kind of power to those who sought it. We will walk those sacred processions, decode the secret rituals performed under the cover of night, and uncover why the Roman authorities tried, again and again, to crush this faith, only to see it rise again, more powerful than before. This is a forgotten chapter of history, and it's time we remembered it. To truly appreciate the revolution she sparked in Rome, we must first travel back to her source, to the banks of the mighty Nile River, where the story of Isis began not as a foreign import, but as the very heartbeat of a civilization. In ancient Egypt, Isis was not a single-faceted deity. She was a cosmic force, a weaver of destinies whose story was as deep and cyclical as the river that sustained the land. Her foundational myth, the Osiris cycle, is one of the most profound narratives to emerge from the ancient world. A tale of love, betrayal, murder, and a quest that redefined the very meaning of life after death. This was the powerful spiritual engine that would eventually be transported to Rome. The story goes that Osiris, the wise and good king married to his sister Isis, was murdered by his jealous brother, Seth. Seth didn't just kill him, he dismembered his body, scattering the pieces across the length of Egypt. It was Isis, with her sister Nephthys, who embarked on a desperate, grieving journey to find every single part. Using her formidable magic, she reassembled her husband, becoming the first embalmer and, in a sense, the inventor of resurrection. This act of divine magic didn't just bring Osiris back to a physical life. It transformed him into the lord of the underworld, the king of the dead. From their subsequent union was born Horus, the falcon-headed god, whom Isis protected in the swamps of the Nile delta from all the dangers Seth could muster. Here we see the three core aspects of the Egyptian Isis that would prove so magnetic to the Romans. She was the devoted wife, whose love transcended even death. She was the ideal mother, fiercely protective and nurturing. And above all, she was the supreme magician, a wielder of words and rituals so powerful she could even challenge the sun god Ra himself. Her power wasn't brute force. It was knowledge, cunning, and an unwavering will. This connected her directly to the world of her worshippers. Just as the Nile flooded, receded, and brought new life to the parched land each year, so too did Osiris die and be reborn through the actions of Isis. She was the goddess of that cycle of death and rebirth, of mourning and joyful restoration. For an Egyptian, the promise was clear. Just as Osiris was resurrected, so too could every faithful person overcome death and achieve eternal life in the fertile fields of the hereafter. This was a deeply personal and hopeful faith, tied to the most fundamental rhythms of nature and human existence. It was this complete package, the powerful myth, the promise of resurrection, and the accessible, caring nature of the goddess, that formed the spiritual cargo carried by merchants, sailors, and soldiers from the port of Alexandria, across the Mediterranean, and into the bustling heart of the Roman world. The Romans didn't just adopt a statue. They inherited a thousands of years old tradition of seeking hope in the face of mortality, a quest that their own state religion had largely ignored. This spiritual revolution, however, did not arrive with a triumphant legion or a royal decree. It slipped into the city almost unnoticed, carried on the tide of mundane, everyday commerce. Sometime in the 2nd century before the Common Era, as the Roman Republic was solidifying its power across the Mediterranean, the first whispers of Isis began to circulate in the port of Ostia and the bustling marketplaces of Rome itself. The initial agents of this spiritual transfer weren't priests or prophets, but a much more pragmatic group: merchants seeking profit, sailors sharing stories from distant Alexandria, and perhaps most poignantly, enslaved peoples from the Hellenistic world who carried their deepest spiritual comforts with them as they were forcibly relocated. These individuals brought not just goods, but gods. Small, personal shrines and amulets depicting Isis nursing Horus would have been among their most precious possessions. Private tokens of a faith that offered solace and a sense of identity in a land that viewed them as property. For these first, quiet adherents, the cult was a deeply personal refuge, a connection to a homeland and a spiritual system that affirmed their humanity in a society that often denied it. This grassroots beginning is crucial to understanding everything that followed. The cult of Isis didn't conquer Rome from the top down. It percolated upwards from the streets, from the homes of the disenfranchised, gaining a quiet, steadfast momentum that the authorities initially underestimated. The Roman Senate, the guardian of the Republic's traditions and its state religion, viewed this foreign infiltration with immediate and profound alarm. To the senatorial class, Roman identity and divine favor were inextricably linked. Their success in war, their political stability, all of it depended on maintaining the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, achieved through the precise, public rituals of the state cult. The gods of Rome were orderly, predictable, and most importantly, Roman. They were part of the civic fabric, The worship of Isis, by stark contrast, seemed chaotic, emotional, and dangerously personal. It was a faith that promised direct access to the divine, bypassing the need for state-appointed priests and the rigid formulas of traditional worship. This was inherently subversive. It suggested that an individual's spiritual fulfillment was more important than their civic duty, a concept that struck at the very heart of the Roman collective identity. Furthermore, the cult's appeal to all social classes, mixing enslaved people, freedmen, and even women of status in shared rituals, was seen as a direct threat to the meticulously maintained social hierarchy. The Senate wasn't just worried about a new god. They were terrified of a social and spiritual virus that could unravel the disciplined, militaristic ethos that had made Rome powerful. They saw in the exotic rituals and the promise of personal salvation not enlightenment, but a dangerous corruption of the austere Roman morals, the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. This fear quickly translated into direct and forceful action. The historical record shows a pattern of repeated, official suppression. In the year 58 before the Common Era, the Senate issued a decree ordering the destruction of all private altars to Isis that had been erected on the Capitoline Hill, the sacred heart of Roman state religion. This was a clear message. This foreign goddess had no place in Rome's most hallowed space. A few decades later, in 48 before the Common Era, the consuls famously tore down another temple to Isis. And in 28, the Emperor Augustus, who was keen on promoting a revival of traditional Roman religion as part of his new political order, explicitly banned the cult from within the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium. These weren't random acts of intolerance. They were calculated political moves. The ruling class understood that belief is power. By attempting to control which gods could be worshipped and how, they were asserting their authority over the hearts and minds of the populace. They recognized that a faith offering personal salvation and transcending social boundaries could become a rival source of allegiance, one that might eventually challenge their own. Yet, despite these repeated, top-down efforts to eradicate it, the cult didn't disappear. It simply went further underground, its practices becoming more secretive, its bonds of community growing stronger in the face of persecution. Each time the Senate thought it had stamped out the influence of Isis, it would resurface elsewhere, its appeal only magnified by its forbidden status. The authorities were fighting a tide with a broom, and the tide, driven by a deep, unmet human yearning, was relentless. Yet the very nature of their suppression reveals just how deeply the roots of the cult had already spread. The Senate's war was not a single, decisive battle, but a protracted, frustrating campaign, marked by decrees that had to be issued again and again because the previous ones had failed to take hold. The first major crackdown came in the year 58 before the Common Era. The Senate, alarmed by the growing visibility of these foreign rites, ordered the destruction of all private altars to Isis that had been erected on and around the Capitoline Hill. This was not a random act of vandalism. It was a calculated, symbolic strike at the very core of Roman civic identity. The Capitoline was the home of the great temples to Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, the ultimate symbols of the Roman state and its divine sanction. To allow a shrine to an Egyptian mother goddess in that hallowed space was seen as a profound pollution, an affront to the gods who had guaranteed Rome's dominance. By targeting these altars, the Senate was attempting to reassert a clear boundary: Roman gods here, foreign gods elsewhere. They were trying to physically carve out the cult from the heart of the city's spiritual and political life. But the people's devotion proved more tenacious than stone. The cult's adherents, refusing to be so easily expelled, simply rebuilt their shrines in other, less conspicuous locations, demonstrating a quiet defiance that would become a hallmark of the faith. This cat-and-mouse game between the state and the devotees of Isis escalated over the following decades. The political and social turmoil of the late Republic created an environment where such spiritual alternatives flourished, even as the authorities redoubled their efforts. In 48 before the Common Era, the consuls Gaius Messius and Valerius took the drastic step of ordering the complete demolition of a temple dedicated to Isis that had been constructed near the city center. Imagine the scene: Roman officials, backed by state authority, overseeing the tearing down of a sacred structure, its cult statues smashed, its altars dismantled. This was more than just an enforcement of a religious decree. It was a public spectacle of power designed to intimidate and dissuade. The message was unequivocal: your goddess is not welcome here. Her worship is illegal. Yet these heavy-handed tactics often backfired. For every temple torn down, the sense of community among the followers grew stronger, bonded by shared persecution. The cult's appeal was now compounded by the allure of the forbidden. To be an initiate was not only to seek personal salvation, but to be part of a secret, resilient community that stood against the overwhelming power of the Roman state. The ultimate expression of this state-level antagonism came with the rise of Augustus and the dawn of the imperial era. Augustus, the first Roman emperor, was a master of symbolism and political theater. His entire regime was built upon a narrative of restoration, the restoration of peace, traditional values, and the old Roman religion after a century of civil war. Central to this project was the promotion of a very specific, state-sanctioned form of piety. He rebuilt decaying temples, revived ancient priesthoods, and promoted the worship of the classic Roman pantheon as a pillar of his new order. In this carefully constructed vision of a renewed Rome, there was no room for a powerful, emotionally charged, and politically ambiguous cult like that of Isis. Around 28 before the Common Era, Augustus made his position brutally clear. He formally banned the cult of Isis from being practiced within the sacred boundary of the city, the Pomerium. This was the most severe and systematic suppression yet. It wasn't just about destroying a single altar or temple. It was an attempt to surgically remove the goddess's presence from the entire urban core, legally erasing her from the official spiritual landscape of the capital. The motivations behind this relentless persecution were far more complex than simple religious prejudice. This was fundamentally a political and cultural battle for the soul of Rome. The Senate and later the emperors viewed the cult of Isis as a direct challenge to their authority for several profound reasons. First, it offered a source of power and identity that existed completely outside the state's control. Unlike the priests of Jupiter, who were senators and statesmen, the priests of Isis were not appointed by the state. Their authority came from their connection to the goddess and their knowledge of her secret rites, which anyone, regardless of birth or status, could potentially access. This undermined the state's monopoly on spiritual authority. Second, the cult's promise of a glorious afterlife, available to all faithful members, presented a radical alternative to the Roman ideal of glory, achieved through public service and military conquest. Why strive for a statue in the Forum when you could achieve eternal life in the fields of Olu? Finally, and perhaps most dangerously, the cult was incredibly popular among segments of society that the aristocracy viewed with deep suspicion: women, enslaved people, freedmen, and merchants. By bringing these disparate groups together in a shared, intense spiritual experience, the cult fostered a form of social cohesion that bypassed the traditional class structure. To a Roman senator, this didn't look like piety. It looked like a potential insurrection of the spirit, a silent revolution brewing in the basements and private gardens of the city, one that no legion could ever truly defeat. And yet, the very walls the Roman state built to contain the goddess Isis were about to be broken down not by rebellious plebeians, but by the most unlikely of figures, an emperor. The turning point arrived with the ascent of Gaius, better known to history as Caligula, a ruler whose reign was marked by a profound and often bizarre fascination with the divine. Where Augustus had seen a threat to be purged, Caligula saw an opportunity. In a stunning reversal of decades of official policy, Caligula did the unthinkable. He not only lifted the ban on the cult within the Pomerium, but he began the construction of a grand, public temple to Isis in the Campus Martius, the Field of Mars. This wasn't a hidden shrine or a private chapel. This was a state-sanctioned, monumental declaration that Isis was now a recognized part of the Roman religious landscape. The motivations behind this radical shift are as complex as the emperor himself. Caligula's hunger for absolute power extended beyond the mortal realm. He famously believed in his own divinity and sought to associate himself with the powerful, exotic deities of the East. The cult of Isis, with its elaborate rituals, its promise of personal divinity, and its immense popularity, was a perfect vehicle for his ambitions. By patronizing Isis, he was aligning himself with a potent spiritual force that operated outside the traditional, senatorial-controlled state religion, thereby bolstering his own autocratic power. He wasn't just tolerating a foreign cult. He was co-opting it, transforming a persecuted underground movement into an imperial instrument. This official embrace did not end with Caligula's tumultuous reign. The Flavian dynasty, which came to power after the civil wars of the Year of the Four Emperors, continued this trend of integration, but with a different, more politically astute purpose. Emperor Vespasian, a pragmatic military man desperately in need of legitimizing his new dynasty, famously spent the night before his triumphant arrival in Rome, not in a temple to Jupiter, but in the sanctuary of Isis in Rome. There he was said to have received a vision, a divine endorsement from the Egyptian goddess that secured his right to rule. It was a masterstroke of political propaganda. By publicly associating his rise with Isis, Vespasian was tapping into her vast popular appeal to cement his own authority, demonstrating that her blessing was now seen as a legitimate source of imperial power. His son, Titus, similarly honored the goddess, and Domitian, another of Vespasian's sons, went even further. He rebuilt the Iseum in the Campus Martius with incredible opulence after a fire, and he prominently featured Egyptian motifs and imagery in his new palace on the Palatine Hill. For the Flavians, Isis was no longer just a personal eccentricity of a previous emperor. She was a pillar of their political brand, a symbol of their connection to the broader, cosmopolitan empire they governed. This imperial fascination reached its zenith with Emperor Hadrian, a man deeply enthralled by Greek and Egyptian culture. His relationship with the cult was intensely personal, forever immortalized in stone and story. The most poignant testament is his sprawling villa at Tivoli, where he constructed a canopus, a long, canal-like pool, flanked by statues and recreations of Egyptian architecture, culminating in a temple dedicated to Serapis, the syncretic god closely associated with Isis. This was not a public political statement like Caligula's temple. This was a private sanctuary, a place for philosophical contemplation and personal grief. The connection becomes heart-wrenchingly clear with the fate of his beloved Antinous. When the young man drowned in the Nile River, Hadrian's response was to deify him, casting him in the role of Osiris, the drowned and resurrected god. In this profound act of personal mythology, Hadrian was directly invoking the core narrative of the Isiac faith, the death in the waters, and the hope of rebirth. He built an entire city, Antinopolis, near the site of the tragedy, ensuring his beloved would be worshipped in the manner of an Egyptian deity, forever linked to the cycle of death and renewal that Isis herself governed. For Hadrian, the cult provided a framework for his own profound sorrow, a mythological language to express an inconsolable personal loss. So why this dramatic reversal from persecution to patronage? The answer lies in the evolving nature of the Roman Empire itself. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome was no longer just a city-state ruling over others. It was a vast, multicultural empire. Emperors realized that to govern this diverse realm, they needed to appeal to more than just the old Roman aristocracy. The cult of Isis, with its immense popularity across the Mediterranean, from Egypt to Gaul, was a powerful tool for building loyalty among the masses. Embracing Isis was a way for an emperor to present himself as a ruler for the entire empire, not just the Roman elite. Furthermore, the nature of imperial power had changed. Emperors, living in an atmosphere of constant intrigue and potential assassination, were drawn to faiths that offered personal salvation and protection. The promise of Isis, that she could save her devotees from the storms of life and death, resonated deeply with men who held ultimate power, but lived in perpetual vulnerability. From Caligula's political calculation to Hadrian's personal grief, the imperial embrace transformed the cult of Isis from a persecuted secret into a public, respected, and enduring fixture of Roman life. A journey that reveals just how deeply this spiritual revolution had already taken root in the heart of the empire. So what did this new, state-sanctioned presence for the goddess actually look like? Imagine yourself as a Roman citizen or a visitor from a distant province, walking through the bustling Campus Martius, the Field of Mars, an area packed with public baths, theaters, and porticos. Your destination is the Iseum Campense, the magnificent temple complex dedicated to Isis and Serapis. This was not a hidden, back-alley shrine. It was a sprawling, awe-inspiring testament to the cult's newfound prominence, a piece of Egypt transplanted directly into the heart of the empire. The complex was a carefully constructed landscape of the sacred, designed to overwhelm the senses and transport the visitor. You would first approach a grand, walled enclosure, a sacred precinct that separated the divine space from the profane city outside. Passing through the gateway, you will be greeted by a breathtaking spectacle of water, stone, and symbolism. Central to the complex was the main temple, the sanctuary itself, likely built in a Greco-Roman style, but bursting with Egyptian iconography. Its columns might have been carved to resemble papyrus bundles, and its walls adorned with hieroglyphic inscriptions and scenes of the goddess, a visual language both exotic and powerful. But the true marvels were scattered throughout the temple grounds, turning the entire area into an open-air museum of Egyptian spirituality. Dominating the space were colossal statues of the gods of the Nile. You would have seen immense figures of the river god Nilus himself, reclining and surrounded by playful putti, each representing one of the 16 cubits of the Nile's perfect flood. Nearby would be his counterpart, the Tiber River god, reimagined in Egyptian form, a clear statement of the fusion of these two great civilizations. Towering above everything were obelisks, those slender, needle-like monuments of red granite, covered in carved hieroglyphs, praising not Egyptian pharaohs, but Roman emperors like Domitian. These were not mere decorations. They were cosmic symbols, connecting the earth to the heavens, their pointed peaks channeling the sun's power down into the sanctuary. The entire complex was a symphony of water features as well as canals, pools, and fountains that constantly murmured in the background. This was a direct reference to the life-giving Nile, the source of all fertility in Egypt, and by extension, a symbol of the life-giving, regenerative power of Isis herself. The air would have been thick with the scent of exotic resins like myrrh and frankincense, burned in offering, mingling with the humid spray from the fountains, creating an atmosphere that was at once foreign and deeply spiritual. This temple was far more than just an architectural marvel. It was a living, breathing hub of community and commerce. The porticos and courtyards of the Iseum would have been filled with people from every walk of life. Priests in linen robes, their heads shaven, moved with purpose, tending to the rituals. Devotees, both men and women, gathered to pray, to make offerings, or simply to bask in the sacred atmosphere. Scholars and philosophers might have been seen debating in shaded corners, drawn by the complex theology of the cult. And everywhere there were vendors. You could purchase small terracotta lamps decorated with the image of Isis, or tiny amulets of her protector, the god Bes. You could buy sacred cakes shaped like animals, or even contract for a personal ritual to be performed by one of the priests. This vibrant, bustling activity shows that the Iseum had successfully integrated itself into the daily rhythm of the city. It was a place of worship, yes, but also a social center, a marketplace of faith, and a tourist attraction. It stood as an undeniable, physical proclamation that the cult of Isis was no longer a clandestine secret, but a permanent and public fixture of Roman religious life, its grand obelisks pointing defiantly to the sky, a testament to a goddess who had, against all odds, conquered her conquerors. But to truly understand the power this goddess held over her followers, we must move beyond the grand public temples and into the hidden, intimate spaces where her most profound mysteries unfolded. For the ultimate goal of a devotee was not merely to worship from a distance, but to undergo a radical, personal transformation through a secret initiation rite. This was the heart of the cult, the moment where the promise of rebirth became a tangible, lived experience. Fortunately, we have an astonishingly vivid account of this very process, left to us by a Roman writer named Appius in his novel, The Golden Ass. While a work of fiction, it is widely believed to be a faithful, if dramatized, depiction of the actual initiation rituals, written by someone who was almost certainly an initiate himself. The story follows a man named Lucius, who, after a series of misadventures that see him magically transformed into a donkey, finally finds salvation through the grace of the goddess Isis. His description of the initiation is our most precious window into this secret world, a journey that was as demanding as it was sublime. The path to initiation was not one taken lightly. It began not with a ceremony, but with a prolonged period of intense preparation and purification. A potential initiate had to prove their sincerity and dedication over many days, even weeks. According to Appius, this involved following strict dietary rules, abstaining from certain pleasures, and undergoing repeated ritual cleansings. The candidate would be bathed and purified, not just for physical cleanliness, but to wash away spiritual impurities, to create a blank slate upon which the sacred mysteries could be written. They would spend days in prayer and contemplation, guided by the high priest, who acted as a spiritual father, interpreting dreams and offering counsel. This preparatory phase was designed to strip away the candidate's old identity, to weaken the attachments of their mundane life, and make them receptive to the profound spiritual shock of the ritual to come. It was a time of heightened anticipation and solemn focus, a deliberate building of tension before the ultimate revelation. Then came the night of the initiation itself, an experience that Appius describes with a sense of awe and reverence, even as he is forbidden from revealing the innermost secrets. Dressed in a new, pure linen robe, Lucius is led by the high priest into the deepest, most sacred part of the temple, the inner sanctuary. He is then confronted with what he calls the very gates of death. The ritual was structured as a powerful drama of symbolic death and rebirth. The initiate was made to undergo a series of ordeals, perhaps involving darkness, sensory deprivation, or guided visualizations, that represented a descent into the underworld, a confrontation with mortality itself. This was the core of the mystery. Just as the goddess Isis had journeyed into the land of the dead to retrieve and resurrect Osiris, so too would the initiate symbolically die and be reborn. Apuleius is intentionally cryptic, but he speaks of traversing all the elements, of approaching the threshold of the underworld and returning, having witnessed the gods themselves. It was a harrowing psychological journey, a guided confrontation with one's own mortality, designed to shatter the ego and the fear of death that accompanied it. Having passed through this symbolic death, the initiate was then reborn into a new life. This was not a metaphorical concept, but a tangible, celebratory reality. Apuleius describes being presented to the community of believers the following morning, dressed in 12 sacred robes of astonishingly intricate symbolism, a garment he calls the Olympian stole. He was then crowned with a glorious palm leaf crown whose fronds shone like rays of light, and he was given a lit torch and placed on a pedestal before a curtain, which was suddenly drawn back. He stood there, revealed to the congregation as a reborn soul, radiant in his new vestments, embodying the sun god himself. The community would erupt in celebration, offering prayers and congratulations. This public presentation was the final, crucial step. The initiate's rebirth was not a private affair. It was certified and celebrated by the entire spiritual family. They were no longer just a seeker. They were a transformed being, a new person who had stared into the abyss and returned, forever changed, and now under the direct protection of the goddess. They had achieved what the vast majority of Romans could only dream of, a direct, unshakable personal connection with the divine, and the unshakable belief that death was not an end, but a doorway. For the dedicated follower of Isis, faith was not a weekly observance, but a constant, living presence, woven into the very fabric of their daily existence. The grand initiations and public festivals were the spectacular peaks of their spiritual life, but it was the quiet, daily rituals that formed its steady, beating heart. This daily devotion centered around the temple, the house of the goddess, and its most sacred resident, the cult statue. Unlike the impersonal, distant gods of the Roman state pantheon, the statue of Isis was not a mere symbol. It was a vessel, a focal point through which her divine presence could be felt, approached, and honored directly. To understand this is to understand the intimate, personal nature of the bond between the goddess and her people. The day for an Isiac devotee began not with the rush of the forum or the demands of work, but with a deliberate turning of attention toward the sacred. Many would make their way to the temple complex in the soft light of dawn, a time when the city was still quiet and the world felt fresh with possibility. They came as individuals from all walks of life, a merchant hoping for a prosperous day, a mother praying for the health of her child, a former slave giving thanks for their freedom, all united in their shared destination. Upon entering the sacred precinct, a sense of profound reverence would descend. The air, still cool from the night, would be stirring with the purposeful activity of the temple's guardians, the priests. Their day began even earlier with their own strict purifications. These men, instantly recognizable by their shaven heads and pure white linen robes, were the intermediaries, the caretakers of the divine presence. Their first and most sacred duty was to awaken the goddess. The main sanctuary, the cella, where the cult statue resided, would be closed to the public overnight. As the sun's first rays touched the temple's obelisks, the high priest, accompanied by his attendants, would perform the ritual of opening the doors. This was not a mundane task, but a powerful ceremonial act. Chanting ancient prayers in Egyptian or Greek, they would unseal the sanctuary, believed to be releasing the divine energy contained within and inviting the goddess to receive the day's worship. The act of opening the temple doors was, in itself, a reenactment of the dawn, a symbolic victory of light over darkness, of order over chaos, mirroring the cosmic power of Isis herself. Once the sanctuary was opened, the focus shifted entirely to the cult statue. For the average Roman, seeing the statue of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill was a rare and distant experience. But for the Isiac, seeing their goddess was the entire point of the visit. The statue, likely made of gilded wood or polished marble, would be an awe-inspiring sight. She might be depicted in the classic Greco-Roman style, but with her unique attributes: a throne-shaped crown, a sheath dress, and holding the sistrum, her sacred rattle, and a situla, a small bucket for sacred Nile water. The most important moment of the morning ritual was the adoration, the act of gazing upon the goddess's face. Devotees would approach the statue with a mixture of fear and longing, offering their silent, personal prayers directly to her serene, powerful visage. This direct visual connection was electrifying. It created a sense of personal relationship that was largely absent from other Roman cults. You weren't just reciting a formula to a distant, abstract power. You were standing in the presence of your Divine Mother, your personal savior, and you were looking into her eyes. This profound visual communion was then made tangible through the act of offering. The offerings brought by devotees were not extravagant sacrifices of bulls or rams, as in the state religion. They were simple, pure, and deeply symbolic gifts, accessible to even the poorest follower. The most common offerings were milk, flowers, and incense. A libation of milk, often from a sacred white cow, was poured at the base of the statue, or on a small altar before it. Milk was the ultimate symbol of nourishment and maternal care, a direct reference to Isis in her role as the nurturing mother of Horus. By offering it, the devotee was both acknowledging her life-giving nature and symbolically partaking in it. Fresh flowers, particularly roses and lotuses, were scattered before her or woven into garlands to adorn her altar. The lotus, with its magical cycle of sinking into the water at night and re-emerging pristine with the dawn, was a potent emblem of resurrection, a daily reminder of the Osirian promise of rebirth that lay at the core of the faith. The fleeting beauty of the flowers also spoke to the cycle of life and death. Their sweet sent a pleasing gift to the goddess, and then there was the incense. As the devotee stood in prayer, a priest would likely approach with a censer, swinging it gently, allowing the rich, aromatic smoke of frankincense or myrrh to envelop the statue and the worshipper alike. The rising smoke was seen as a physical bridge between the earthly and divine realms, carrying the prayers and the essence of the offerings up to the heavens. The scent itself was believed to purify the space and please the goddess, creating an atmosphere that was at once sacred and sensuous. This multisensory experience, the sight of the gilded statue in the lamplight, the sound of the softly chanted prayers, the feel of the cool marble floor, the taste of the sacred milk or cakes sometimes distributed after the offering, and the overwhelming smell of flowers and incense, combined to create a total immersion in the divine. It was a daily recalibration of the soul, a moment of peace and connection before stepping back out into the noisy, demanding world of Rome. For the Isiac devotee, this daily ritual was not an obligation, but a necessity, the quiet, recurring heartbeat of a faith that promised and delivered, a direct and personal connection to a goddess who was always listening. Of all the public expressions of the cult, None was more vibrant, more theatrical, or more joyously public than the Navigium Isidis, the ship of Isis. Celebrated every year on the 5th of March, this spectacular festival was the Roman equivalent of a grand opening ceremony, a city-wide party that officially declared the end of winter's treacherous storms and the safe reopening of the sea lanes for trade and travel. But it was far more than a practical maritime event. It was a powerful, living drama that brought the mythology of Isis into the very streets, transforming the entire city into a stage for her power and benevolence. For one dazzling day, the secretive, mystical cult stepped out of the shadows of its temples and into the brilliant sunlight, showcasing its immense popularity and its deep integration into the social fabric of Rome. The festivities began at the Iseum, the temple complex in the Campus Martius. As dawn broke, the temple gates would swing open, and the procession would begin to assemble, a gathering of such color and spectacle that it would stop the entire city in its tracks. At the head of the parade were the priests, their shaven heads gleaming, robed in spotless white linen, carrying the sacred symbols of the goddess. Some bore the revered cult statues of Isis and her consort Serapis, veiled and carried on ornate litters, their divine presence leading the way. Others shook the sistrum, that distinctive bronze rattle, whose rhythmic, percussive jingle was the unmistakable soundtrack of the cult, a sound believed to purify the air and ward off malevolent forces. The clatter of the sistrums was joined by the chanting of hymns in both Latin and Egyptian, creating a soundscape that was at once familiar and exotically foreign to Roman ears. Following the priests came a breathtaking cast of characters straight out of mythology and ritual. Men and women in lavish costumes embodied various deities and spirits. You would see figures dressed as Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, his long snout peering curiously at the crowd, a reminder of the cult's power over the afterlife. There were also attendees representing Harpocrates, the god of silence, with his finger to his lips, and other figures from the Egyptian pantheon. But the procession was not just for the clergy and the elite. It was a truly democratic celebration. A huge cross-section of Roman society joined the throng, wealthy patrons who had funded the festivities, merchants praying for a profitable shipping season, sailors offering gratitude for safe passage, and countless common citizens simply swept up in the joyous atmosphere. The crowd itself became part of the ritual, a moving river of faith and celebration that wound its way from the temple, through the bustling forums, and down toward the Tiber River. The climax of this grand parade, its undisputed star, was the ship itself. This was not a seaworthy vessel, but a beautifully crafted, elaborate model, a sacred effigy built for this single, glorious purpose. It was a miniature masterpiece, meticulously constructed and lavishly decorated. Its hull was painted in bright colors, often with beeswax, and its single sail was woven from the finest, snow-white linen. Upon this pristine sail, prayers and dedications to Isis were inscribed in golden thread, so that as it moved through the city, it literally carried the hopes and prayers of the people forward. The ship was loaded not with cargo, but with symbolic offerings, incense, spices, and other precious tokens meant to appease the goddess of the seas. Carried high on the shoulders of devoted followers, this glittering vessel was the pulsating heart of the procession, a moving beacon of hope and divine favor. Upon reaching the banks of the Tiber River, the procession reached its ecstatic finale. The priests would lead the crowd in a series of final, fervent prayers and hymns, their voices rising in a powerful chorus over the water. Then, with great ceremony and the cheers of the multitude ringing in the air, the sacred ship was carried to the water's edge and launched onto the current of the river. This was the moment of ultimate symbolism. The little ship, bearing its offerings and inscribed prayers, was set adrift, to be carried down the Tiber and out into the vast Mediterranean Sea. This act represented the opening of the sailing season, a direct petition to Isis Pelagia, Isis of the sea, to calm the waves and protect all who traveled upon them. It was a physical sending forth of their faith, trusting the goddess to guide not just this model ship, but every real ship that would follow in its wake in the months to come. The crowd would watch until the vessel disappeared from view, a collective act of hope and release, their fates now literally in the hands of the goddess. The public impact of the Navigium Isidis cannot be overstated. This was the cult's annual debutante ball, its massive, unmissable advertisement. For the millions of Romans who might never set foot inside the inner sanctum for a secret initiation, this festival was their primary connection to Isis. It showcased her not as a stern, judgmental deity, but as a benevolent, joyful protectress, a goddess of commerce, travel, and community well-being. The sheer spectacle reinforced her popularity and normalized her presence. Furthermore, the festival was a masterclass in religious syncretism, the blending of beliefs. While its core was Egyptian, its timing and purpose dovetailed perfectly with Roman practical life. The Roman state could hardly object to a celebration that so clearly benefited the empire's economic lifeline, maritime trade. By blessing the fleets, Isis was, in effect, blessing Rome itself. The Navigium Isidis was far more than a parade. It was a brilliant piece of public relations that demonstrated the cult's evolution from a persecuted secret to a beloved and essential part of the Roman world. A faith that could command both the deepest private mysteries and the most spectacular public celebrations. Yet for all its spectacular public festivals and deeply personal daily rituals, the ultimate magnetic core of the cult's appeal lay in its revolutionary theology, a profound promise of salvation that spoke directly to the anxieties of life within the vast, impersonal machinery of the Roman Empire. At the heart of this promise stood Isis herself, not as a distant regional deity, but in her self-proclaimed role as the universal savior. This was a goddess who deliberately presented herself as the single, supreme answer to the spiritual longings of an entire world. In one of the most famous surviving hymns to her, discovered at her temple in Medinet Madi in Egypt, and echoed in inscriptions across the Roman world, she declares her own power in stunning terms. "I am the one who is called the goddess by women. I broke down the boundaries of nations and the horizons of countries. I made the paths straight. I carved the rivers for all people to drink. I am the queen of the rivers and the winds and the sea." This was not a quiet, modest claim. It was a cosmic mission statement. She presented herself as the divine force behind civilization itself, the unifier of humanity, and the source of all natural order. For a Roman citizen living in a sprawling empire of countless cultures and languages, this vision of a single, all-encompassing, and benevolent Divine Mother was a powerfully unifying and comforting concept. This universality was perfectly captured by one of her most popular titles, She of 10,000 Names. This was a masterstroke of theological marketing. It did not mean she was confusing or fragmented. Rather, it signified that she was the singular, ultimate reality behind every other goddess known to humanity. To the Greeks, she was Demeter, the goddess of the harvest. To the Phoenicians, she was Astarte. To the Romans, she could be identified with Ceres, or even with Juno. The message to a potential convert was both simple and brilliant. "You already worship me, you just call me by a different name. Come, know my true identity, and receive the fullness of my grace." This approach removed the barrier of abandoning one's ancestral gods. Instead, it offered an upgrade, a deeper understanding of the divine that reconciled cultural differences under one supreme feminine principle. A sailor from Carthage, a merchant from Syria, and a born and bred Roman matron could all stand side by side in her temple, each understanding her through their own cultural lens, yet united in their devotion to the same universal mother. This theological inclusivity was a radical departure from the exclusive, often nationalistic, claims of traditional Roman religion. The salvation she offered was not some abstract, philosophical concept reserved for philosophers. It was a tangible, twofold promise that addressed the two greatest human fears, the trials of mortal life and the terrifying unknown of death. Firstly, she offered personal comfort and intervention in the here and now. Isis was worshipped as a goddess of practical, everyday miracles. She was Isis Sotera, Isis the Savior, who could protect her followers from the sudden storms of life, as literally as she protected sailors from the storms of the sea. A devotee might pray to her for healing from an illness, for success in a business venture, or for the safe return of a loved one from a long journey. The stories of her miraculous interventions, her aretalogies, were widely circulated. These were first-person accounts, often inscribed on stone, where individuals recounted how the goddess had saved them from shipwreck, cured a seemingly fatal disease, or rescued them from unjust imprisonment. This created a powerful feedback loop of faith. Every published miracle story was a testimonial, reinforcing the belief that Isis was not a distant ruler, but an attentive, caring parent, who actively listened and responded to the pleas of her children. The second, and arguably more powerful, aspect of her salvation was the promise of a blessed afterlife. This was the cult's ultimate spiritual commodity, and it was something that traditional Roman religion offered only to a select, heroic few. For the average person, the Roman underworld was a grim, shadowy place, a passive existence of forgetfulness and sorrow. The mystery cult of Isis completely inverted this bleak vision. Through the myth of Osiris, it promised that every faithful initiate could share in his triumphant resurrection. Death was not an end, it was a transformation, a passage to a glorious new life. Upon death, the soul of the devotee, guided by the prayers of the living and their knowledge of the secret rites, would embark on a journey. They would be judged before Osiris, but unlike the terrifying judgment in other traditions, the Isiac follower was equipped for success. Their initiation had prepared them. They knew the passwords, the symbols, and the hymns needed to navigate the perils of the afterlife. They could confidently identify the gods they met and declare their innocence. A successful judgment led to admission into the Fields of Olu, a celestial version of the lush, fertile Nile Delta, a paradise of eternal light, abundant food, and peaceful communion with the gods and other blessed souls. This was not a vague hope. It was a certainty offered to anyone who underwent her rites, from the wealthiest patron to the lowliest servant. In a world filled with political instability, disease, and the constant threat of violence, this guarantee of a joyful eternity provided an unshakable psychological anchor, a profound peace that the official state cults simply could not match. This theology of universal salvation and personal care fundamentally redefined the relationship between the human and the divine. In the traditional Roman framework, the gods were powers to be negotiated with through precise, contractual rituals, a do ut des principle of, I give so that you might give. The relationship was formal, distant, and often transactional. But with Isis, the relationship was one of love, loyalty, and gratitude. The Latin term for this was pietas, but it was a pietas directed toward a maternal figure. The initiate was her child, her loyal servant, and she was their loving protector. This emotional, personal bond is beautifully illustrated in the prayers left to her. They are filled with intimate language, calling her my lady, my savior, and holy perpetual savior of the human race. This shift from a contractual obligation to a heartfelt devotion represents one of the most significant spiritual transformations in the ancient world. It laid the groundwork for the kind of personal, salvific faith that would later characterize Christianity. The cult of Isis successfully marketed a spiritual solution for an age of empire, a universal goddess for a universal world, who offered a personal savior for every individual soul, providing both comfort for the journey of life and a triumphant victory over the finality of death. In the rigidly patriarchal society of ancient Rome, where a woman's life was largely defined by her relationship to a man, first her father, then her husband, the cult of Isis offered a breathtaking alternative. While the traditional Roman state religion confined women to passive roles, as silent participants in household rituals, or as Vestal virgins whose power was contingent on their celibacy and isolation, the world of Isis was radically different. Here, women weren't just allowed, they were essential. They held positions of genuine authority, managed significant financial resources, and commanded respect as spiritual leaders, creating a parallel social structure where their influence was not just acknowledged but celebrated. This was one of the most socially revolutionary aspects of the entire cult, providing a rare and powerful space for female agency in a world that systematically denied it. The most visible manifestation of this female authority was the role of the priestess. Unlike the state-appointed, exclusively male priesthoods of Jupiter or Mars, the hierarchy of Isis was open to women, who could rise to the highest echelons of religious leadership. These women were not mere attendants. They were skilled ritual specialists, interpreters of divine will, and leaders of the congregation. Imagine a woman like the one Apelles describes in the Golden Ass, the high priestess of Isis who guides the protagonist, Lucius, through his transformation. She is portrayed as a figure of immense wisdom, compassion, and unshakable authority, a spiritual mother to her flock. In real life, inscriptions from Ostia and Pompeii commemorate women with titles like Sacerdos Isidis, priestess of Isis. These women presided over ceremonies, offered interpretations of dreams, which were considered direct messages from the goddess, and likely oversaw the daily rituals of opening the temple and adorning the cult's statue. Their shaven heads, a mark of their devotion, were a public declaration that their identity was no longer tied to the conventional Roman ideals of female beauty, tied to elaborate hairstyles, but to their sacred office. This was a profound act of reclamation. In a culture that so heavily valued a woman's physical appearance and her role in producing heirs, the priestess of Isis defined her worth by her spiritual knowledge and her direct connection to the divine. But the power of women within the cult extended far beyond the sanctuary walls, reaching into the very economic foundations of the faith. In the competitive, status-driven world of Roman cities, one of the primary ways to gain influence was through public benefaction, known as evagetism. Wealthy men would fund new forums, bathhouses, or gladiatorial games to earn public favor and political clout. For wealthy Roman women, however, such avenues were severely limited. They could not hold political office, and their public roles were carefully circumscribed. The cult of Isis provided a prestigious and spiritually meritorious outlet for their wealth and ambition. We have numerous archaeological records of women acting as generous patrons, or patroni, of local Isia. They funded the construction of new temple buildings, paid for the costly imported marble for statues, and donated precious ritual objects like silver sistrums or golden vessels for libations. An inscription from the port city of Puteoli, for example, records a woman named Fabia Aconia Paulina, who, along with her husband, dedicated a temple to Isis. Another from Pompeii tells of a woman named Nivolia Titch, who funded a large and elaborate altar. By bankrolling the cult, these women were not just earning the gratitude of the community, they were securing their own legacy and ensuring their names would be remembered in the very stones of the goddess's house. This was a form of public immortality that was otherwise largely inaccessible to them, a way to carve their identity into the spiritual landscape of their city. This financial influence translated directly into social power. A woman who funded a new wing for the temple or sponsored the annual Navigium Isidis festival would have been a central figure in the community. She would have been consulted on matters of importance. Her opinions would have carried weight, and she would have enjoyed a level of respect and autonomy that was exceptional for her time. The cult provided a sanctioned social network that operated outside the traditional, male-dominated spheres of the forum or the senate. Within this network, women of different classes, wealthy patrons, priestesses, and ordinary devotees, could interact and form bonds based on shared faith rather than social rank. This created a powerful sense of female solidarity. For an elite Roman matron, her involvement with Isis was a way to exercise leadership and influence that complemented, and sometimes even circumvented, the authority of her husband. For a freedwoman or a merchant's wife, it was an opportunity to gain social standing and a voice in a community that valued her contributions. The cult effectively created a counterculture, a space where the traditional Roman patriarchal hierarchy was softened, and in some cases entirely inverted, based on devotion and generosity rather than gender and birth. The theology of Isis herself powerfully reinforced this elevation of the feminine. She was not a consort or a passive wife. She was the single most powerful actor in her own mythos. The entire story of Osiris hinges on her actions. It is Isis whose love drives her to search the world for her husband's body. It is Isis whose magical prowess reassembles him and brings about his resurrection. It is Isis whose cunning and protective fierceness save her son, Horus, from all dangers. She is the active, intelligent, and powerful force of creation and salvation. This stood in stark contrast to the idealized Roman woman, the Univera, the one-man woman whose virtues were chastity, obedience, and quiet loyalty. Isis was a model of a different kind of feminine power. She was a wife, a mother, and a formidable, independent divine agent. For her female worshippers, this was an incredibly empowering archetype. They weren't praying to a goddess who represented a man's ideal of womanhood. They were worshipping a goddess who embodied female strength, intelligence, and autonomy in its most potent form. This divine reflection gave them a theological justification for the authority they wielded within the cult, legitimizing their leadership in the eyes of their fellow worshippers, and most importantly, in their own eyes. The profound social freedom offered by the cult did not go unnoticed by its critics, who often weaponized this very aspect in their attacks. Some conservative Roman writers, like Juvenal in his satires, mocked the cult precisely because of the prominent role of women, portraying them as hysterical and gullible, easily manipulated by charismatic priests. This criticism, however, reveals more about Roman anxieties than it does about the cult itself. The sight of women exercising independent spiritual and financial power was deeply threatening to the traditional social order. The fact that a woman could leave her home at dawn to participate in temple rituals, that she could control significant funds for religious donations, and that she could hold a position of authority over men was a subversion of everything the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, was supposed to represent. The critics understood that the cult of Isis wasn't just changing how people worshipped. It was subtly reshaping social relationships, offering women a platform for self-determination that the traditional structures of Roman society actively worked to suppress. In this sacred space, a woman's piety and her purse held more sway than her husband's political connections, creating a unique and powerful refuge where the divine feminine was not just revered, but actively embodied by her most faithful followers. While the cult offered a profound sense of community and belonging, its day-to-day operations and most sacred functions were orchestrated by a structured, professional priesthood that stood in stark contrast to the part-time, politically appointed priests of the Roman state religion. This was not a casual volunteer role. Becoming a priest or priestess of Isis was a life-altering commitment, a complete dedication of one's existence to the service of the goddess. Their authority didn't come from political connections or family lineage, but from a perceived divine calling, rigorous training, and a demonstrated mastery of the complex rituals that formed the backbone of the faith. This professional spiritual class was the engine that kept the cult running, ensuring the daily ceremonies were performed with perfect precision, and the profound mysteries of initiation were conveyed with the proper gravity. Their very appearance set them apart. Both male and female priests would have been instantly recognizable by their shaved heads, a powerful public renunciation of vanity and a mark of their sacred office. They wore robes of the purest, brightest white linen, a fabric considered ritually clean and symbolically connected to the light of the divine, setting them visually apart from the wool-wearing masses in the Roman streets. At the very apex of this spiritual hierarchy stood the high priest, a figure who commanded immense respect and wielded significant influence within the community. Known by the title Isiarch in Greek or Sacerdos Maximus in Latin, he was far more than just a ritual specialist. He was the chief executive, the chief theologian, and the spiritual father to the entire congregation. His responsibilities were vast and weighty. He was the ultimate guardian of the cult's secret knowledge, the one entrusted with preserving the precise words of the ancient prayers, the correct gestures for the rituals, and the hidden meanings behind the symbols. It was the high priest who had the final say on who was spiritually ready for the great initiation, acting as a guide and mentor through the intense preparatory period. He was also the public face of the temple, managing its often considerable finances, overseeing its properties, and representing the cult in any dealings with the civic authorities. In many ways, he operated like the CEO of a major religious corporation, ensuring the spiritual and material well-being of the entire operation. His authority was personal and charismatic, based on his perceived closeness to Isis, and his word within the community was often law. Supporting the high priest was a collar of specialized priests and priestesses, each with their own distinct duties that kept the sacred machinery of the temple functioning smoothly. Among the most important were the stolists, whose title means adorner of the robe. Their duty was one of immense privilege and reverence, the daily care and dressing of the cult statue. This was not a mere cleaning chore. It was a deeply symbolic ritual in itself. The stolist would enter the inner sanctuary, carefully anoint the statue with precious oils, dress it in fresh, fine linen robes, and adorn it with jewelry and flower garlands. This act was believed to be a direct service to the goddess, a way of maintaining and honoring her physical presence among her people. Then there were the prophets or prophetesses, who served as interpreters of the divine will. They were the experts in dream interpretation, a practice central to the cult, as dreams were considered direct messages from Isis. A devotee troubled by a vivid dream would seek out a prophet to decipher its hidden meaning, whether it was a warning, a promise, or a call to action. Other specialists included hymn singers, who led the congregation in sacred chants, and musicians, who played the distinctive sistrum during processions and ceremonies, using its rhythmic rattle to purify the space and invoke the goddess's presence. At the foundation of this priestly structure were the pastophoroi, a title that literally translates to shrine bearers or symbol bearers. While this might sound like a lowly position, they were essential functionaries, the workhorses of the temple. Think of them as a combination of sacristans, porters, and security guards. Their duties were practical and varied. They were responsible for the maintenance and security of the temple buildings and its sacred objects. They would have carried the sacred shrines and the cult statues during the grand public processions like the Navigium Isidis, a task requiring both physical strength and solemn reverence. They likely managed the crowds of worshippers during busy festivals, ensuring order was kept, and they may have even assisted in the preparation of ritual items and offerings. While they were not the ones performing the most secret rites, their role was indispensable. They formed the backbone of the temple's daily operations, the dedicated support staff who ensured that the stage was perfectly set for the higher-ranking priests to perform their sacred dramas. Without the reliable service of the pastophoroi, the elaborate and seamless functioning of the cult would have been impossible. Perhaps the most fascinating and distinct figure within this hierarchy was the Isiacus, a type of independent, freelance male priest who often operated outside the confines of a major temple. The term itself simply means a man of Isis, but it came to denote a specific kind of religious practitioner. Unlike the priests attached to a large Iseum who worked as part of a collegiate body, the Isiacus was often a one-man show. He was a religious entrepreneur, a spiritual specialist for hire. You might find him setting up a small shrine in a port city, offering prayers and minor rituals for sailors about to embark on a voyage. He might be hired by a wealthy family to perform a private ceremony in their home, perhaps for healing, protection, or to bless a new business venture. The Isiacus embodied the personal, accessible nature of the cult, bringing the power of Isis directly to the people in a flexible, individualized way. His authority came entirely from his own knowledge and personal charisma. He would have carried his own set of ritual tools, a small statue of the goddess, a sistrum, perhaps a container for sacred water, a portable temple he could set up anywhere. This model stood in radical opposition to the rigid, location-bound priesthoods of the Roman state, demonstrating the cult's ability to adapt and thrive in countless different social contexts. This entire structure presented a profound contrast to the priesthoods of the official Roman state religion. In Rome, the most prestigious priesthoods, like the Pontifex Maximus or the Flame Diales, the High Priest of Jupiter, were almost exclusively political appointments. They were held by senators and aristocrats as part of their civic careers, often with little requirement for deep theological training or a personal divine calling. Their primary function was to perform the public, state-funded rituals with exactitude to maintain the Pax Deorum, the peace with the gods, for the benefit of the Roman state as a whole. It was a duty to the city, not a personal relationship with the divine. The priesthood was a public office, and its power was derived from the state it served. The Isiac priesthood, by contrast, was a vocation. Its power was charismatic, derived from the perceived favor of the goddess and the priest's specialized, secret knowledge. While a Roman state priest served the Senate and the people of Rome, an Isiac priest served Isis and her community of believers first and foremost. This fundamental difference in the source and purpose of priestly authority highlights the core distinction between a religion of the state and a religion of personal salvation, a distinction that made the cult of Isis so compelling to so many and, from the perspective of the traditional Roman elite, so dangerously independent. This remarkable journey of the cult of Isis, from persecuted secret to imperial favorite, was not accomplished by force, but through a brilliant and deliberate theological strategy. One of the most powerful tools in their arsenal was a process known as syncretism, the conscious and creative blending of different religious traditions. Instead of demanding that Romans abandon their ancestral gods, the priests and theologians of Isis performed a kind of spiritual alchemy. They began to systematically identify their Egyptian mother goddess with the most beloved and important deities already resident in the Roman pantheon. This wasn't a clumsy rebranding exercise. It was a sophisticated theological argument, a way of saying to a potential Roman convert, "You already revere the power of Isis, you just know her by another name." This approach dramatically lowered the barrier to conversion, making the foreign goddess feel familiar, accessible, and even more powerful than the gods Romans had known their entire lives. Perhaps the most intuitive of these syncretic pairings was with Venus, the Roman goddess of love, beauty, and sexual desire. On the surface, this connection seems straightforward. Isis, in her core myth, was the devoted wife whose love for Osiris was so powerful it transcended death itself. Her entire quest to reassemble his body was driven by an unwavering, passionate love. This narrative resonated deeply with the domain of Venus, but the Iseac theologians took this connection much further. They began to promote Isis as Isis Venus, emphasizing not just romantic love, but a more cosmic, generative love. They highlighted her role as the mother of Horus, presenting her as the source of all life and fertility. In this guise, she was often depicted in art with the classic attributes of Venus, such as a seashell or a mirror, while still retaining her own unique iconography, like the throne-shaped crown or the sistrum. This fusion was incredibly effective. A Roman matron praying for a happy marriage or a successful pregnancy could now direct her devotions to Isis Venus, receiving the comfort of the familiar Roman goddess, amplified by the profound, salvific power of the Egyptian mother. It allowed Romans to approach Isis through a cultural doorway they already understood and trusted. An even more profound syncretism linked Isis with Ceres, the ancient Roman goddess of the harvest, agriculture, and the fertility of the earth. This pairing tapped into the most fundamental rhythms of life and death. Ceres was the central figure in the Roman Eleusinian mysteries, a myth where her daughter, Proserpina, is abducted by Pluto, god of the underworld. Ceres' grief causes the earth to become barren until a compromise is reached, and Proserpina returns for part of the year, bringing spring and summer. The parallels with the Osiris myth are striking, and were undoubtedly emphasized by Iseac missionaries. Both stories revolve around a goddess mourning a loved one who has descended into the realm of death, Osiris for Isis, Proserpina for Ceres. Both narratives explain the cyclical nature of life. The Nile's flood and retreat mirrored the seasonal growth and decay of the harvest. Just as Ceres' actions brought life back to the earth, Isis's magic brought life back to Osiris. By aligning herself with Ceres, Isis effectively claimed authority over the entire natural order. She was not just a goddess of a faraway river. She was the force behind the grain in the fields of Italy, the divine power that ensured the bread would rise and the people would be fed. This gave her a tangible, everyday relevance that touched every single citizen, from the farmer in the countryside to the urban dweller buying bread in the forum. But the most politically and personally significant syncretism was arguably with Fortuna, the powerful and notoriously fickle goddess of luck, fate, and fortune. Fortuna was one of the most widely worshipped deities in the Roman world, because her favor was seen as essential for success in everything from business and love to military campaigns and political careers. Her capricious nature, however, made her terrifying. Fortuna could bestow immense wealth and power one day, and snatch it all away the next. The cult of Isis offered a revolutionary reinterpretation of this divine force. They presented their goddess as Isis Fortuna, but with a crucial difference. While the traditional Roman Fortuna was blind and random in her blessings, Isis Fortuna was portrayed as wise, discerning, and merciful. She did not dispense fate arbitrarily. She rewarded piety, loyalty, and moral conduct. This was a complete game changer. It transformed the terrifying uncertainty of luck into a system of divine justice and benevolent oversight. A merchant praying to Isis Fortuna for a successful voyage wasn't just hoping for a lucky break. He was appealing to a rational, caring goddess who would protect him because of his faithful devotion. This idea is powerfully illustrated in the many inscriptions and prayers that survive, where devotees thank Isis Fortuna for saving them from shipwreck or financial ruin, attributing their good fortune not to chance, but to the deliberate intervention of a gracious deity. This strategic syncretism was a masterstroke of religious diplomacy. It allowed the cult to seamlessly integrate itself into the existing spiritual landscape of Rome without triggering the kind of cultural resistance that a purely foreign deity might have provoked. By wrapping herself in the identities of Venus, Ceres, and Fortuna, Isis didn't appear as a threatening outsider. She appeared as the ultimate fulfillment and unification of everything those Roman goddesses represented. She absorbed their domains and then expanded upon them, offering not just love, but love that conquers death. Not just a good harvest, but the promise of personal resurrection. Not just fickle luck, but a guaranteed salvation based on faith and devotion. This theological framing made her immensely palatable and relatable, easing her acceptance not only among the common people, but even within the higher echelons of society, who were steeped in traditional Roman culture. The genius of this approach was that it didn't require Romans to give up their old gods. It simply invited them to see those gods as different faces of one, supreme, all-encompassing Divine Mother, whose power was both universal and intimately personal. Yet for all its profound success, the cult of Isis did not exist in a spiritual vacuum. The religious landscape of imperial Rome was a vibrant, crowded marketplace of salvation, where numerous mystery cults vied for the hearts and souls of the populace. Understanding Isis's unique position requires seeing her in this competitive context, standing alongside two other major rivals for the Roman spirit, the deeply masculine and secretive cult of Mithras, and the wildly ecstatic cult of Cybele. Each offered a distinct path to transcendence, appealing to different facets of the human experience, and carving out its own demographic niche in the bustling spiritual economy of the empire. Consider first the cult of Mithras, a faith that presented a stark, almost polar opposite to the world of Isis. If the Iseum was a place of public procession, flowing linen, and open community, the Mithraeum was a hidden, underground sanctuary, a windowless chamber designed to resemble a cave. This was a religion defined by its exclusivity and its rigid hierarchy. Perhaps its most defining characteristic was its complete and total exclusion of women. Mithraism was a fraternity of the faithful, a spiritual brotherhood for soldiers, merchants, and imperial bureaucrats' men, who moved in the structured, hierarchical world of Roman administration and the military. Its theology was not centered on a nurturing mother goddess, but on the heroic struggle of the god Mithras, a divine warrior who subdued the primordial bull, an act that was believed to generate and sustain all life. This was a narrative of conquest, strength, and cosmic order, deeply resonant with the military ethos that still underpinned Roman imperial power. Its rituals were not public spectacles, but intensely secret initiations conducted in small, intimate groups. Initiates progressed through 7 grades, each with its own symbolic name like raven, lion, and father, creating a clear military-like chain of command within the faith. The appeal of Mithraism was its promise of fraternal solidarity, spiritual discipline, and a divinely sanctioned order. It offered men a sacred space to reinforce the bonds and values they lived by in their professional lives, a celestial mirror of the legion or the imperial office. Where Isis offered the comfort of a mother, Mithras offered the camaraderie of a brotherhood and the clarity of a ranked command structure. In stark contrast to the all-male world of Mithras stood the cult of Cybele, the Great Mother, whose worship presented a different kind of challenge to the more orderly and inclusive approach of the Iseum faith. Cybele's origins were in Phrygia, in modern-day Turkey, and her rites were infamous for their raw, unrestrained emotional intensity and bloody fervor. Her most devoted male followers, known as the Galli, would, in a state of ecstatic frenzy, ritually castrate themselves in imitation of her beloved Attis, who did the same after betraying her. This act of ultimate devotion, of surrendering one's masculinity entirely to the goddess, was both terrifying and fascinating to the Roman mind. Public processions for Cybele were spectacles of a different order than the joyous Navigium Isidis. They featured wild music from flutes and tambourines, frenzied dancing, and the Galli, now living as women, slashing their own arms to offer their blood on her altars. This was religion at its most primal, an embrace of divine madness and the terrifying power of the feminine to demand the ultimate sacrifice. While the cult of Isis also had its ecstatic elements, its rituals were ultimately contained within a framework of order and a promise of joyful rebirth. Cybele's worship was a more chaotic and terrifying plunge into the abyss of divine possession. It appealed to those who sought the most extreme forms of liberation from their earthly identities, offering a transcendental experience born not of serene hope, but of violent, ecstatic surrender. These three major cults, therefore, carved out distinct territories in the Roman soul based on their core demographics and theological focus. Mithraism was the cult of the professional man, the soldier, and the imperial civil servant. It reinforced the patriarchal structures of Roman public life, offering spiritual advancement that mirrored a military or administrative career. Its appeal was to those who found meaning in order, hierarchy, and exclusive male fellowship. The cult of Cybele, on the other hand, was the cult of the outsider and the ecstatic. Its most fervent adherents were those willing to break completely with societal norms, to embrace a form of worship that was shocking, visceral, and transformative in the most literal and physical sense. It offered a powerful, if terrifying, path for those who felt alienated from the mainstream and sought a direct, overwhelming encounter with raw divine power. The cult of Isis brilliantly positioned itself between these two extremes. It was more emotionally accessible and public than the secretive Mithraism, yet more orderly and philosophically grounded than the chaotic rites of Cybele. It was remarkably inclusive, welcoming men, women, enslaved people, and free citizens alike into a community that valued personal piety and moral purity. Its appeal was universalistic. A Roman soldier might find solace in Mithras. A social outcast might find a home with Cybele, but a merchant, his wife, their children, and their servants could all find a place together within the welcoming embrace of Isis. She did not demand the rejection of one's social role or the mutilation of one's body. She offered a spiritual upgrade to one's existing life, promising protection in this world and glory in the next. This balanced, inclusive, and hopeful message allowed the cult of Isis to achieve a breadth of popularity and a depth of integration that neither of its major rivals could ever quite match, ultimately making it one of the most successful and enduring religious movements in the entire Roman world before the rise of Christianity. Now let's step beyond the rituals of this life and peer into the ultimate promise that fueled such devotion, the Isiac vision of the afterlife. For a Roman, the traditional underworld was a grim, shadowy place. The poet Virgil describes it as a land of silent, sorrowful shades flitting through the gloom, a joyless, passive existence stripped of memory and vitality. It was a fate to be dreaded, a slow fading away in the misty fields of asphodel. The state religion offered little comfort. Your legacy was a monument in the forum or the memory of your deeds, not a blessed eternity for your soul. The cult of Isis shattered this bleak paradigm entirely. It replaced that cold, impersonal abyss with a vibrant, sun-drenched paradise known to the Egyptians as the Field of Reeds, a celestial mirror of the lush, fertile Nile delta. And they offered it not just to pharaohs, but to every faithful initiate. This was a revolution in Roman eschatology, a direct, personal and joyous afterlife achieved not through heroic conquest, but through pious devotion and sacred knowledge. The journey to this paradise was not automatic. It was a carefully mapped spiritual itinerary that began the moment the heart stopped beating. The soul of the deceased, now separated from the body, was believed to embark on a perilous journey through the underworld, a realm filled with treacherous gates, demonic guardians, and illusory paths. This journey was a direct adaptation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, but tailored for a Roman audience. The initiate was not sent into this chaos unprepared. Their time spent in the cult, their participation in the secret rites, and their daily devotions were all a form of spiritual training. They had been given the maps and the passwords. Through the initiation ritual, which symbolically enacted a death and rebirth, they had already, in a sense, previewed the journey. They knew the names of the gods they would meet and the correct hymns to sing to appease them. They carried with them the sacred knowledge of the goddess's power, a kind of divine safe conduct pass that would guide them safely through the perils of the afterlife. This transformed death from a terrifying unknown into a challenging but manageable pilgrimage, a final test for which the faithful were thoroughly equipped. The climax of this posthumous journey was the judgment of the soul, a concept the cult imported from Egypt and refined for its Greco-Roman adherents. The soul would be led into the magnificent Hall of Two Truths, a grand columned chamber presided over by Osiris, the resurrected Lord of the Dead, who sat enthroned in serene majesty. Surrounding him would be a council of 42 divine judges, each representing a different nome or district of Egypt and a specific moral principle. This was not a vague, fear-based judgment. It was a meticulous, legalistic proceeding that resonated deeply with the Roman love for order and jurisprudence. The soul's heart, the seat of its conscience and will, was the key piece of evidence. In a breathtaking moment of cosmic theater, the god Anubis would carefully place the deceased's heart on one side of a great scale. On the other side, he would place the feather of Maat, the symbol of truth, justice, and cosmic order. The fate of the soul hung in the literal balance. If the heart, weighed down by sin and falsehood, was heavier than the feather, a monstrous creature aptly named the Devourer would wait to consume it, resulting in a second, final death's true annihilation. But the Isiac follower faced this judgment with profound confidence, armed with a powerful tool known as the negative confession. This was a meticulously prepared declaration of innocence, a list of 42 sins the soul could truthfully claim it had not committed. The initiate would stand before Osiris and the divine judges and recite, "I have not stolen, I have not slain, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not falsified the scales." This was not a mere recitation of words. It was the culmination of a life lived according to the moral code of the cult, a code that emphasized purity, truthfulness, and social harmony. The heart, having been shaped by a life of piety and purified through the cult's rituals, would hopefully be as light as the feather of truth. This process offered something the traditional Roman underworld never could: a clear ethical path to salvation. Your social status or political power meant nothing here. What mattered was the weight of your own heart, the truth of your own character, judged by an impartial, divine court. For the soul that passed this ultimate test, the reward was almost unimaginable in its beauty and personal fulfillment. They were granted access to the field of reeds, the Iseum paradise. This was not a vague, ethereal heaven, but a vividly concrete and joyous eternal life. Imagine a landscape of eternal, golden sunlight, crisscrossed by glittering canals, brimming with pure, life-giving water. The fields were eternally ripe with grain, and the fruit trees hung heavy with sustenance. Here the blessed dead would reunite with their loved ones, their bodies restored to their prime, free from sickness and sorrow. But this was not an eternity of passive leisure. It was a life of purposeful, joyful activity. You could build your own house, tend your own garden, and sail your boat on the peaceful waterways. One particularly beautiful Egyptian text promises that the blessed will go in and out by day, receive offerings, and have power over the water. This was an afterlife that perfectly mirrored the most idealized version of earthly life, a prosperous, peaceful, and fertile existence, but one made permanent and perfect. For a Roman, whether a farmer dreaming of fertile land, or an urban dweller yearning for peace and stability, this was a powerfully attractive vision. It was a personal, eternal homestead, granted by a gracious mother goddess to her loyal children. This radical promise fundamentally redefined the Roman relationship with mortality. The traditional Roman funerary inscription, Hic situs est, here he lies, emphasized the finality of the grave. The Iseum afterlife, by contrast, was a beginning, not an end. Tomb inscriptions from initiates began to reflect this triumphant new hope. They no longer spoke merely of a life lived, but of a journey undertaken. Phrases appear invoking the protection of Isis and Osiris, expressing a confident expectation of a blessed existence in the beautiful West. This shift represents one of the cult's most profound psychological impacts. It replaced the quiet despair of the classical underworld with the vibrant hope of a personal eternity. The cult did not just offer companionship in this life. It offered a guaranteed, joyous destination in the next. A sun-drenched paradise where the faithful would live forever in the presence of the gods they had served so devotedly. It was the ultimate fulfillment of the goddess's promise. The final, glorious reward for a heart made light through faith, knowledge, and the unwavering grace of Isis. Nowhere was the power of Isis more tangible and immediate to her followers than in the realm of magic, a force the Egyptians understood not as superstition, but as a fundamental, operational law of the universe. To them, this was Heka, the very energy that the gods used to create the cosmos, a power that flowed through everything and could be harnessed by those who knew the correct words, names, and rituals. In this divine science, Isis was not merely a practitioner. She was the undisputed supreme master, the greatest sorceress of all. Her legendary reputation rested entirely on the most profound magical feat imaginable, the resurrection of a god. The myth of Osiris was, at its core, a story of ultimate magic. It was Isis who, through her incantations and her deep knowledge of the secret names of power, reanimated her husband's dismembered body, not to a temporary, ghostly existence, but to a new, eternal life as Lord of the underworld. This act established her as the patroness of all who sought to use supernatural means to alter their fate, to heal the sick, to protect the vulnerable, and to triumph over the seemingly irreversible power of death itself. For her Roman devotees, this meant that their goddess wasn't just a comforting presence. She was an active, potent force who could be invoked to directly intervene in the messy, unpredictable realities of everyday life. This practical application of magic was seamlessly woven into the daily fabric of an Isiac's existence, primarily through the use of amulets, which served as portable conduits of the goddess's protective power. These were not mere jewelry or trinkets. They were sacred tools, meticulously crafted and ritually charged to act as a constant, personal shield for the wearer. The most common and potent of these was the tayet, often called the knot of Isis, or the buckle of Isis. This amulet, shaped like a looped knot with dangling ends, was made from red jasper or red glass, its color symbolizing the blood of Isis and the life-giving power she wielded. Just as a knot can bind and secure, the tayet was believed to bind the protective magic of the goddess directly to the individual, safeguarding them from illness, accidents, and malevolent spirits. A mother might tuck one into the swaddling clothes of her newborn. A sailor would wear one around his neck before a voyage, and a merchant might carry one to ensure fair deals and protect his goods. Another ubiquitous amulet was the ujat, or the Eye of Horus. This symbol, representing the eye that was wounded in the battle with Seth and then magically restored, was a powerful emblem of wholeness, healing, and protection. Wearing an ujat was believed to grant the user the soundness of body and mind that the restored eye represented, guarding against physical ailments and the evil eye of envy. For the average Roman, who lived in a world filled with very real dangers from disease, crime, and misfortune, these small objects were a source of profound psychological comfort and a tangible connection to the goddess's magical might, a divine insurance policy worn directly on the body. Beyond these passive protections, the cult offered active, personalized magical interventions through the use of binding spells and inscribed prayers, a practice that reveals a fascinating blend of Egyptian tradition and Roman pragmatism. These spells, known to scholars as defictions or curse tablets, were often thin sheets of lead, a metal associated with the chthonic underworld powers. On these sheets, a petitioner would inscribe a specific, often desperate, request. They might seek to bind the tongue of an opponent in a lawsuit, to inflame the heart of a reluctant lover with passion, or to cripple the business of a commercial rival. The methodology was strikingly direct. The petitioner would often roll or pierce the lead sheet, symbolically binding or harming the target, and then deposit it in a place considered a gateway to the divine or the underworld, a sacred spring, a tomb, or most tellingly, buried in the grounds of an Iseum. What's remarkable is how these traditionally aggressive spells were adapted within the Isiac context. The petitioner would frequently invoke the name and authority of Isis, Serapis, or Anubis to legitimize and empower their request. A typical spell might begin, "I deposit this with you, Serapis, and I bind my enemy so that he may not speak against me." This practice demonstrates a seamless fusion. The Roman legalistic mindset of making a formal petition was combined with the Egyptian belief in the power of the spoken and written word, all channeled through the authority of the Isiac pantheon. It shows that followers saw their goddess not only as a source of benevolent protection, but also as a just arbiter who could be called upon to enforce their will and rectify wrongs in a competitive and often unjust world. At the heart of all this magical practice was the immense power attributed to language itself, particularly the secret, true names of the gods. In Egyptian cosmology, to know the true hidden name of a deity or a spirit was to have absolute power over it. This concept is brilliantly illustrated in a famous myth, where Isis herself uses this very principle to force the sun god Ra to reveal his most secret name. The story goes that Ra had grown old, and as he drooled, his spittle fell to earth. Isis gathered some of this spittle, mixed it with clay, and fashioned a venomous serpent. She placed the serpent in Ra's path, and it bit him. The aging god, in excruciating pain that none of his own magic could cure, was forced to plead with Isis for help. She agreed, but only on the condition that he whisper his true, secret name to her, the source of his ultimate power. Trapped and suffering, Ra relented. The moment Isis learned his name, she gained authority over him, and she subsequently became the mistress of the gods, her power now rivaling his own. This myth was a foundational text for the cult's magical philosophy. It taught that even the king of the gods was subject to the laws of Heka, and that knowledge, cunning, and the correct use of divine names could grant a mortal unparalleled influence. For an initiate, this meant that the hymns they sang, the prayers they recited, and the secret names they learned during their initiation were not just acts of devotion. They were tools of immense power. By speaking the sacred words with perfect precision, they were participating in the same cosmic force that Isis had used to resurrect Osiris, aligning their own will with the fundamental mechanics of the universe to bring about real, tangible change in their lives. The ultimate expression of this belief in the power of ritual words was the practice of temple incubation, a deeply personal form of magical healing that merged prayer with therapeutic sleep. A devotee suffering from a persistent illness, infertility, or a troubling spiritual affliction would journey to an Iseum to seek a direct cure from the goddess. After undergoing purification rituals and making offerings, they would be granted permission to sleep within the sacred precinct of the temple, often in a special chamber or hall designated for this purpose. The belief was that during this holy sleep, Isis or her son, the healing god Harpocrates, would appear to them in a dream. This was not a passive hope. It was an active, anticipated intervention. The dream vision itself was the cure. The goddess might touch the afflicted part of their body. She might offer them a symbolic object, like a cup of healing water, or she might simply speak words of power that would banish the illness. Upon waking, the supplicant would recount their dream to a temple prophet, a specialist in dream interpretation, who would decipher the divine message and often prescribe a specific course of action, perhaps a special ointment, a prayer to be recited, or a lifestyle change. This practice was the pinnacle of the cult's practical esotericism. It offered a direct, unmediated, and magical solution to human suffering, blending the psychological power of suggestion and the placebo effect with an unshakable faith in the goddess's ability to reach across the boundary between the divine and mortal realms to enact real, physical healing. It transformed the temple from a simple house of worship into an active, supernatural clinic, where the ultimate magician, Isis, continued her work of restoration and salvation, one faithful sleeper at a time. But how do we move beyond ancient texts and crumbling temple foundations to truly touch the world of an Iseum devotee? The answer lies in the silent, yet powerfully eloquent, testimony of the objects they left behind. Archaeology provides us with a tangible bridge to these people, allowing us to hold in our hands the very items they used in their daily worship, and to walk through the spaces they decorated with their faith. These artifacts, statues, lamps, and frescoes are not just relics. They are frozen moments of devotion, each one telling a story about the hopes, fears, and deep spiritual connection that define the cult's presence across the Roman world. Perhaps the most evocative of these finds are the countless statues of Isis Fortuna, a syncretic form that perfectly captures the goddess's role in the everyday lives of her followers. These were not colossal monuments for public squares, but smaller, more intimate figures designed for homes and private shrines. Imagine a Roman merchant, perhaps someone who had just survived a perilous sea journey, commissioning a statuette for his household altar. The artist would depict Isis in the classic Greco-Roman style, but with her unique attributes. She stands gracefully, one hand holding a cornucopia, the horn of plenty overflowing with fruit and grain, a symbol of Fortuna's bountiful favor. In her other hand, she grips a rudder, which she rests upon a globe, representing her role as the pilot of human destiny, steering the fortunes of the world and the individual with wise and benevolent control. Upon her head rests the lunar disk nestled between cow horns, a direct link to her Egyptian identity as the mother of Horus. This single statue is a complete theological statement. It tells the worshipper that the goddess who controls the unpredictable whims of luck is not capricious, but is, in fact, the same all-powerful mother who offers salvation and abundance. To have this figure in your home was to have a constant, visual reminder that your fate was in the hands of a caring, capable deity, not blind chance. These statues have been unearthed from Britain to Syria, a testament to the universal appeal of this comforting and powerful image. While statues represented a more permanent investment of faith, the most common and personal artifacts connecting ordinary people to Isis are the humble terracotta oil lamps. In an age before electric light, these small, functional objects were essential to daily life, and their design became a perfect canvas for religious expression. Thousands of these lamps, molded with the image of Isis, have been discovered in Roman ruins. Picture a family in a modest insula or apartment building in Rome. As evening fell, they would light their lamps, and the flickering flame would cast dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the goddess's serene face stamped into the clay. She might be shown with her crown and sistrum, or sometimes in the act of a ritual, like the Navigium Isidis. The symbolism here is profound and beautiful. The lamp itself was a tool against the darkness, both literal and metaphorical. By using a lamp adorned with Isis's image, the devotee was invoking her protection throughout the night, asking her to be the light that banished not only the physical gloom, but also the spiritual darkness of fear, ignorance, and evil. These were not expensive items. They were affordable for almost anyone. This mass production tells us that the worship of Isis permeated all levels of society. It was a faith you could carry in your hand, a small, warm glow of divine presence that accompanied the most mundane moments of life, from a family meal to late night work, constantly reinforcing the bond between the human and the divine. For a truly breathtaking immersion into the visual world of the cult, however, we must travel to Pompeii and Herculaneum, the cities frozen in time by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Here, archaeology doesn't just give us objects. It gives us entire rooms, preserved with their vibrant wall paintings intact. The most famous of these is a fresco from Herculaneum, often interpreted as a scene of priestly initiation within the cult of Isis. The painting is a riot of color and sacred activity. We see a priest, his head shaved in the traditional manner, dressed in a white linen robe. He is intently reading from a sacred scroll, perhaps reciting the precise, powerful words of a ritual hymn. Nearby, another figure, likely an initiate, undergoes a purification ritual. Water is being poured, and a sacred vessel is held ready. The most striking detail is the presence of the Isiac symbols. The golden sistrum rattle lies prominently on a step, and the masked head of the god Anubis looks on. His jackal features a stark reminder of the cult's Egyptian roots and its power over the realm of the dead. This fresco does more than any written description could. It places us directly in the room. We can almost hear the murmur of the prayers, smell the incense, and feel the tense, expectant atmosphere of a sacred ceremony about to unfold. It shows us that these rituals were not somber, gloomy affairs, but vibrant, communal, and deeply sensory experiences, full of color, music, and profound meaning. Other frescoes from Pompeii expand this visual narrative, depicting the goddess herself in various roles. In one beautiful example, we see Isis welcoming the Greek heroine Io into Egypt, a scene that ties her to the broader tapestry of Mediterranean myth. The goddess is depicted as a majestic and compassionate figure, her blue cloak symbolizing the sky and the cosmic scope of her power. These paintings adorned the walls of wealthy private homes, demonstrating that devotion to Isis was not confined to the temple. It was a faith that people wanted to live with, to see every day in their own domestic spaces. The owners of these homes were making a public declaration of their spiritual allegiance, integrating the goddess into their daily environment in the most beautiful way possible. The art served as a constant meditation on her myths and her power, transforming a dining room or a courtyard into a personal sanctuary. The survival of these frescoes is a gift of unparalleled historical value. They allow us to bypass 2,000 years and look directly through the eyes of a first-century Roman, to see the goddess not as an abstract concept, but as a living, vibrant presence, rendered in the brilliant colors that her worshippers believed reflected her true celestial glory. Each of these artifacts, from the grand statue to the simple lamp, forms a crucial piece in the archaeological puzzle of the cult of Isis. Together they build an incredibly rich and textured picture of a living, breathing faith. They show us a religion that was both public and intensely private, that offered grand theological concepts for the philosopher and simple, comforting symbols for the common person. They reveal a devotion that was expressed not only in secret initiations and loud public festivals, but also in the quiet moments of a household lighting its lamps at dusk, or gazing upon a beautiful wall painting. Through these physical remnants, the ancient worshippers of Isis achieve a kind of immortality. They can no longer speak to us directly, but through the statues they commissioned, the lamps they held, and the frescoes they admired, they have left behind a powerful and moving testament to a goddess who captured their hearts, guided their destinies, and lit their way through the darkness of the ancient world. To truly grasp the scale and vitality of this faith in the daily life of a Roman city, we must journey to a place where time itself was stopped in its tracks, Pompeii. Nestled just a short walk from the city's main theater and triangular forum, the Temple of Isis stands as one of the most perfectly preserved religious sites from the entire ancient world. Its survival under the volcanic ash of Vesuvius offers us an unparalleled snapshot, a frozen moment that captures the cult not in its early, persecuted days, but at the very peak of its local influence and prosperity. Approaching the temple, a first-century visitor would have been struck not by overwhelming size, but by its intricate, self-contained sacredness. Unlike the grand public spaces dedicated to Jupiter or Apollo, the Iseum at Pompeii was a more intimate complex, a walled sanctuary that created its own world separate from the bustling, noisy streets outside. Passing through the main entrance, you would find yourself in a large, open courtyard, the heart of the complex. Directly ahead stood the main temple itself, positioned on a high, central podium reached by a steep flight of stairs. This elevated platform made the small, elegant structure the undeniable focal point, ensuring that the cult statue of Isis within would have been visible to all gathered in the courtyard below during ceremonies. The temple was designed in a classic Roman Italic style, but its soul was utterly Egyptian. The walls of the surrounding portico were covered in breathtakingly vibrant frescoes depicting scenes from the myth of Isis and Osiris. as well as Egyptian landscapes teeming with pygmies, crocodiles, and hippopotamuses, creating an immersive, exotic environment that transported the worshipper far from the Campanian countryside. The layout was a masterclass in ritual functionality. To the right of the temple stood a small, separate shrine dedicated to Harpocrates, the god of silence, reminding initiates of the secrets they were sworn to keep. Nearby, a pit or puteal provided access to sacred water, likely used in purification rites, and a larger altar stood in the courtyard for public sacrifices. Every element, from the main temple to the smallest auxiliary building, was meticulously arranged to facilitate the complex liturgical life of the cult. This thriving center of worship, however, bore the scars of a recent and devastating trial. 17 years before Vesuvius erupted, in 62 AD, a massive earthquake struck the Bay of Naples, causing catastrophic damage throughout Pompeii. The Temple of Isis was hit exceptionally hard. Archaeological evidence shows that the main temple was severely compromised, with its columns shattered and its superstructure collapsing. The surrounding portico was heavily damaged, and many of the priceless ritual objects were buried under rubble. For a lesser cult, this might have been a death blow. But what happened next speaks volumes about the wealth, dedication, and social standing of the Isiac community in Pompeii. Immediately after the disaster, a massive and expensive restoration project was launched. The man who funded this entire endeavor was a freedman, a former slave, named Numerius Perpidius Ampliatus. In one of the most telling inscriptions ever found at the site, Ampliatus boasts that he paid for the temple's reconstruction from its foundations in the name of his 6-year-old son. In the rigidly stratified world of Roman politics, this was a strategic masterstroke. By doing so, the freedman father secured his young son, Numerius Perpidius Celsinus, a seat on the Pompeian town council, an honor that would have otherwise been nearly impossible for the child of a former slave to attain. This single act reveals everything. It shows that the cult was a powerful vehicle for social mobility. A wealthy freedman could use his devotion to Isis to buy his family legitimacy and political influence that their birth status denied them. The temple's rapid and magnificent restoration, funded not by the state, but by a private individual from a marginalized class, is powerful testament to the deep loyalty of its adherents and their immense financial resources. They did not just rebuild, they made it more beautiful than before, a defiant declaration of their faith's resilience. The treasures found within the restored temple walls, when archaeologists excavated it centuries later, paint a stunning picture of its vitality in the years leading up to the final catastrophe. The ash that buried Pompeii did not destroy, it preserved. Within the temple's many chambers, excavators discovered a veritable treasury of sacred objects, a complete ritual inventory frozen in time. In the main cella, they found the fragments of the cult statue itself, along with a beautiful, life-sized statue of the goddess in her Hellenized form. But it was the smaller finds that truly brought the daily life of the temple to life. A stunningly detailed bronze hand, delicately crafted to hold a sacred offering, was discovered. They unearthed a magnificent silver egg, a potent symbol of rebirth, and a small, exquisitely carved ivory hand holding a figure of the goddess. Most poignant of all were the small, personal items left behind by worshippers: a delicate gold ring, a collection of precious gems, and over 100 lamps, many of them still containing the soot from their final use. These were not the artifacts of a faith in decline. They are the possessions of a vibrant, active, and wealthy community. The sheer value of the silver, gold, and bronze objects indicates significant investment from the congregation. The abundance of lamps suggests nocturnal rituals were common. filling the courtyard with flickering light and long shadows, creating an atmosphere of profound mystery. Every object, from the grandest statue to the smallest amulet, tells a story of a community that poured its heart, its soul, and its considerable fortune into the worship of their Divine Mother, right up until the very end. The ultimate testimony to the cult's enduring presence is written not just in the temple's artifacts, but in the tragic final moments preserved by the volcanic ash. When Vesuvius began its fateful eruption on that August day, the temple was not abandoned or deserted. Evidence suggests that a small group of individuals, perhaps priests or dedicated worshippers, sought refuge within the sacred precinct, maybe believing the goddess would protect them until the last possible moment. Their remains were found huddled together, a silent, heartbreaking testament to their final devotion. But perhaps the most powerful evidence of the cult's deep-rooted vitality comes from an unlikely source: a piece of graffiti scrawled on the wall of a nearby house. It reads, "Si cuspiam pansum idylum Isiasi rogant." The worshippers of Isis ask for the election of Cuspius Pansa as Aedile, one of the city's chief magistrates. This single casual scrawl is a historical thunderclap. It reveals that the Isiasi, the followers of Isis, acted as a coherent, recognized political bloc. They had the numbers, the organization, and the confidence to publicly back a candidate for high political office. This is a world away from the persecuted, secretive cult of the Roman Republic. In Pompeii, just years before its destruction, the devotees of Isis were an integrated, powerful, and vocal part of the civic body. They were not hiding in the shadows. They were out in the streets, leveraging their collective influence to shape the political future of their city. The Temple of Isis in Pompeii, therefore, is far more than a ruin. It is a time capsule that captures the culmination of the cult's long journey. It shows us a faith that was locally funded, richly adorned, politically savvy, and central to the lives of its diverse followers, from the wealthiest patron to the most humble initiate, all united in their devotion to the goddess who promised to conquer death itself. The transformation of the cult of Isis from a persecuted sect to an imperial favorite reached its zenith with the rise of specific emperors who did not merely tolerate the goddess, but actively sought her out as a source of personal power and divine legitimacy. This profound shift is perfectly embodied by the first emperor of the Flavian dynasty, Vespasian, a man whose entire claim to the throne rested on a perceived miracle that occurred not in a temple to Jupiter, but within the sacred confines of the Serapeum in Alexandria. After the chaotic year of the four emperors, Vespasian was a military commander with a formidable army, but no bloodline connection to the revered Julio-Claudian line. He needed a sign, a public and undeniable endorsement from the gods to cement his authority. While in Alexandria in the year 69 of the Common Era, he and his son Titus reportedly visited the great temple of Serapis, the syncretic god closely linked to Isis. According to the historian Tacitus, two local men, one blind and the other with a crippled hand, were brought before Vespasian, beseeching him for a healing that a divine oracle had foretold only an emperor could perform. The story goes that Vespasian, initially skeptical, was persuaded by his advisors. He placed his spittle on the blind man's eyes and his foot upon the crippled hand, and miraculously, both men were cured. This was not just a random act of healing. It was a meticulously staged political and religious theater. By receiving this divine favor from Serapis, a core deity of the Isiac faith, Vespasian was publicly announcing that his right to rule came not from the senatorial class in Rome, but from a powerful cosmopolitan god whose influence stretched across the entire Mediterranean. He was essentially co-opting the immense popular appeal of the Isiac cult, to legitimize his own brand new dynasty, demonstrating that the blessing of Isis and Serapis was now a political currency as valuable as any legion. This calculated embrace of the cult was not an isolated incident, but a family affair, solidified by his son Domitian, whose devotion took on a far more personal and architectural form. Where Vespasian used the cult for political theatre, Domitian integrated it into the very fabric of Rome's cityscape and his own identity. After a fire damaged the Iseum in the Campus Martius, Domitian undertook its reconstruction with staggering opulence, transforming it into one of the most magnificent religious complexes in the city. He populated it with colossal statues of the Nile and Tiber rivers, and erected towering red granite obelisks, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs that praised not Egyptian pharaohs, but Domitian himself. This was more than simple patronage. It was a statement of cosmic alignment. By associating his name and image so prominently with the symbols of Egypt's eternal power, Domitian was presenting himself as a universal ruler, an emperor for the entire known world, whose authority was sanctioned by the oldest and most mysterious gods. This fascination extended to his personal life. He built a vast palace on the Palatine Hill, and within its sprawling rooms, Egyptian motifs and statues of Isis and Anubis have been discovered, suggesting the goddess had a place within his most private spaces. For Domitian, a ruler often portrayed as paranoid and autocratic, the cult offered more than public legitimacy. It offered personal protection and a direct line to a savior goddess who promised to shield her devotees from the very real threats of betrayal and assassination that plagued his reign. However, the most notorious and revealing case of an imperial convert is undoubtedly Commodus, the son of the philosophic emperor Marcus Aurelius, whose reign descended into a spectacle of megalomania and violent excess. Ancient historians like Cassius Dio and Herodian document with a mixture of horror and fascination Commodus's deep involvement in the rites of Isis and other Eastern deities. He didn't just fund the cult, he actively participated in its most exotic and demanding rituals. They describe him carrying the sacred statue of Anubis in public processions, his head shaved like a traditional priest, and performing the duties of a pastophorus, one of the temple's lower-ranking functionaries. To the conservative Roman aristocracy, this was an appalling breach of imperial dignity. The emperor was supposed to be the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of the Roman state religion, a figure of sober piety and tradition. For him to be seen publicly acting as a servant for a foreign goddess, carrying her sacred objects and submitting to her priests, was a shocking inversion of the established order. But for Commodus, this was the entire point. His actions were a deliberate rejection of his father's Stoic philosophy and the austere traditions of the Roman past. He craved not just political power, but a form of personal divinity, and the elaborate, theatrical, and emotionally charged rituals of the Iseum cult provided the perfect stage for his performance. By immersing himself in its mysteries, he was not lowering his status. In his mind, he was elevating it, aligning himself with a divine power that transcended the boring, bureaucratic gods of the Roman state, and placing himself directly within the cosmic drama of death and rebirth. The motivations that drove these very different men, the pragmatic Vespasian, the grandiose Domitian, and the unhinged Commodus, toward the cult of Isis, reveal a fundamental shift in the nature of imperial power itself. For these emperors, the traditional Roman state religion, with its focus on civic duty and collective well-being, was no longer sufficient to address their personal and political needs. They ruled over a vast, diverse, and often unstable empire, and they lived in constant fear of conspiracy and revolt. the cult of Isis offered something the old gods could not: a promise of personal salvation and divine protection. Isis was Sotera, the savior, a goddess who could personally intervene to protect her followers from the storms of life, whether those were political upheavals or assassination attempts. For an emperor, this was an incredibly attractive proposition. Furthermore, by aligning themselves with a goddess whose worship was ubiquitous from Britain to Syria, they were making a powerful statement to the entire empire. They were presenting themselves as universal monarchs, whose authority was blessed by a universal deity, a strategy that helped to build loyalty among the multicultural masses of the empire far more effectively than the parochial Jupiter Optimus Maximus ever could. The journey of the cult, from the back alleys of the Republic to the private chambers of the emperors, marks one of the most remarkable reversals in religious history. It demonstrates that spiritual yearning could not be legislated away, and that a faith offering personal connection and triumph over death would eventually find its way to the very peak of society, transforming the persecutor into the most powerful devotee. Yet for all its resilience and imperial favor, the cult's long and triumphant history in Rome was entering its final, fading chapter. The world was changing, and a new spiritual revolution was sweeping across the empire, one that would prove far more formidable an opponent than the Roman Senate had ever been. This was the rise of Christianity, a faith that in many ways was the cult of Isis's most direct and formidable rival. On the surface, they shared surprising similarities. Both offered a personal, salvific relationship with a single, powerful deity. Both promised a glorious afterlife for the faithful, triumphing over death. Both fostered tight-knit communities that transcended social class. But beneath these surface parallels lay a fundamental and ultimately irreconcilable difference in their very nature. The cult of Isis was, by its theological design, inclusive and syncretic. It was comfortable absorbing other gods, presenting itself as the ultimate truth behind all divine faces. Christianity, by stark contrast, was fundamentally exclusive. Its central tenet was monotheism of the most uncompromising kind. The Christian God demanded not just primary devotion, but the complete rejection of all other gods, who were now redefined not as different faces of the divine, but as demonic false idols. This set the stage for an ideological war that the porous, adaptable world of Roman paganism was uniquely ill-equipped to fight. The initial relationship between the two faiths was not one of outright war, but of intense competition for the same spiritual marketplace. Early Christian apologists, the intellectual defenders of the new faith, saw the cult of Isis as one of their most significant rivals, and they launched a targeted literary and theological campaign against it. They recognized the power of her imagery and her myths, and so they sought to systematically dismantle and discredit them. The most powerful weapon in their arsenal was the charge of demonology. To these Christian writers, Isis was not a benevolent mother goddess. She was a deceiving demon, and her magnificent statues were empty vessels inhabited by malevolent spirits, leading souls away from the one true God. Her ancient and profound mysteries were recast as vulgar superstition. Her beautiful public processions were labeled as licentious carnivals, and her deeply symbolic rituals were mocked as meaningless magic tricks. This was a battle for the very definition of the sacred, and the Christians fought it with a polemical ferocity that the old pagan world had never mustered. They didn't just want to defeat Isis. They wanted to erase her moral and spiritual legitimacy, to make her worship seem not just outdated, but actively evil. This theological conflict remained a war of words for centuries, but the balance of power shifted decisively in the early 4th century with the conversion of Emperor Constantine. His Edict of Milan in 313 granted tolerance to Christianity, transforming it almost overnight from a persecuted sect into a favored religion of the imperial court. For the next several decades, a fragile and often tense coexistence prevailed. Pagan temples, including those of Isis, still operated, and some emperors, like Julian the Apostate, even attempted a brief revival of the old gods. But the tide had irrevocably turned. The imperial machinery was slowly but surely becoming aligned with the Christian cause, and the political winds were blowing against the ancient pagan traditions. The old cults, including that of Isis, found themselves on the defensive, no longer battling for new souls, but fighting a rearguard action for their very survival. The cultural atmosphere grew increasingly charged, with Christian mobs sometimes attacking prominent pagan sites, testing the limits of imperial tolerance, and demonstrating the growing confidence and militancy of the new faith. The final decisive blow fell during the reign of Emperor Theodosius I, a ruler whose fervent Christian piety would earn him the title, the Great in the Church, but whose policies spelled doom for the religious world of classical antiquity. In a series of sweeping decrees issued between 381 and 392, Theodosius moved from merely favoring Christianity to actively criminalizing paganism itself. The most pivotal of these was the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, which made Nicene Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire. This was followed by even more explicit laws. In 391, he issued a decree that explicitly forbade all pagan worship, both public and private. It banned sacrifices, closed temples, and declared that entering a pagan sanctuary to venerate an idol was an act of high treason against the state. The state that had once torn down altars to Isis out of political fear was now, under Theodosius, using its full legal and military power to systematically dismantle her entire spiritual empire in the name of a new theological orthodoxy. The enforcement of these laws was swift, brutal, and often symbolic. The magnificent Iseum Campense in Rome, the grand temple complex in the Campus Martius that had stood for centuries as a testament to the cult's imperial acceptance, was ordered closed. Its doors were sealed, its priests disbanded, but closure was often just the prelude to outright destruction. Across the empire, zealous Christians, now emboldened by imperial sanction, took matters into their own hands. The most famous example is the destruction of the Great Serapeum in Alexandria around 391, the very same temple where Vespasian had claimed his divine mandate. A Christian mob led by the patriarch Theophilus stormed the complex, toppled the colossal cult statue of Serapis, and burned its legendary library of pagan texts. The temple was then converted into a Christian church. This event sent a shockwave throughout the Mediterranean world. It was a clear signal that the age of compromise was over. The same pattern unfolded on a smaller scale at countless other sites. The Temple of Isis at Pompeii, so lovingly restored after the earthquake, was likely seized and abandoned. Its sacred statues were torn from their pedestals. Its ritual objects were smashed or melted down for their precious metals, and its walls, once adorned with beautiful frescoes of the goddess, were left to decay or were deliberately defaced. What followed was a slow, painful fading. The public heart of the cult was ripped out. Without the daily rituals in the temples, without the grand processions of the Navigium Isidis, and without the ability to publicly initiate new members, the faith began to wither. The knowledge of the secret rites, passed down for generations from high priest to initiate, began to fragment and disappear as the priestly class was dispersed, and had no one to whom they could safely transmit their mysteries. For the ordinary devotee, the risk became too great. What was once a source of social prestige and spiritual comfort was now a dangerous, illegal activity that could bring the wrath of both the state and one's Christian neighbors. The deep personal faith did not vanish overnight, of course. In remote villages and within private households, people likely continued their quiet devotions for generations, whispering prayers to the goddess in secret. But the vibrant, public and communal religion that had so captivated Rome for nearly half a millennium was gone. The cult that had survived persecution by the Roman Republic and had been embraced by emperors could not survive its final, most determined adversary. A monotheistic state religion that saw its very existence as an existential threat to the salvation of every human soul. The long reign of Isis was over, her temples silent, her statues buried, her name fading into the realm of myth and memory. This brings us to one of the most fascinating and hotly debated questions in the history of religion. Did the ancient worship of Isis, in some way, shape the very foundations of Christianity? As this new faith began to spread through the same Roman streets and ports, once dominated by the processions of Isis, striking parallels began to emerge, parallels that have fueled scholarly controversy for centuries. The core of this debate revolves around a powerful idea: that early Christianity, in its formative years, didn't simply compete with the cult of Isis, but may have absorbed some of its most potent symbols and theological concepts to make its message more resonant in the Greco-Roman world. It's a theory that challenges traditional narratives, suggesting a hidden dialogue between two of history's most influential salvific faiths. One of the most visually arresting and frequently cited parallels is the iconic imagery of the Divine Mother and Child. For centuries before the birth of Christ, all across the Roman Empire, you could find countless statues and paintings depicting the Egyptian goddess Isis, seated majestically, nursing her divine son, Horus. This image, known as Isis lactans, was one of the most widespread and beloved religious icons of the ancient world. She was the protective, nurturing mother, and he was the divine child, the heir to his father's kingdom, who would one day defeat the forces of chaos. Now, fast forward to the early centuries of the Common Era. In the catacombs of Rome and in early Christian art, we begin to see the emergence of a remarkably similar composition. The Virgin Mary seated, holding the Christ child on her lap. The visual echo is undeniable. Proponents of the borrowing theory argue that early Christians, seeking a visual language that would be immediately understandable and emotionally compelling to pagan converts, naturally adopted this pre-existing, deeply beloved archetype. They replaced Isis with Mary and Horus with Jesus, effectively baptizing a pagan symbol into the new faith. This wasn't about deception. It was a brilliant piece of cultural translation. By presenting Mary in the familiar pose of Isis, Christianity could communicate Mary's role as the Theotokos, the God-bearer, to a population that was already conditioned to revere a powerful, caring divine mother. However, scholars who are skeptical of direct borrowing offer a compelling counter-argument. They point out that the theme of a mother and child is, in itself, a universal human archetype. Every culture has its sacred or heroic figures who are born from a special mother. The uniqueness, they argue, lies not in the image itself, but in the specific theology behind it. In the Egyptian myth, Isis is a goddess in her own right, a powerful cosmic force. Mary, in Orthodox Christian doctrine, is a human woman, a vessel for the divine, but not divine herself. The significance of the Christian image is centered entirely on the child, Jesus, who is God incarnate. The skeptics suggest that the similarity is better explained by a common human tendency to express the sacred through the deeply relatable bond of mother and infant, rather than by one faith consciously copying the other. This back and forth highlights the difficulty of tracing influence. Is it direct borrowing, or simply two different cultures arriving at a similar powerful image to express different, yet related, ideas about divine protection and incarnation? Beyond the powerful imagery of the Mother, an even more profound parallel exists in the core narrative of a dying and rising God. The central story of the Iseum faith was the murder and dismemberment of Osiris, followed by his miraculous reassembly and resurrection by his wife-sister, Isis. Through her magical prowess, Osiris did not return to his old earthly life, but was transformed into the Lord of the Underworld, the King of the Dead, offering the promise of a similar resurrection to all his faithful followers. This story of a God who triumphs over death was the beating heart of the cult's mystery rites. When we look at early Christianity, we see a faith whose entire theology is built upon the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. The structural similarity is striking. A good divine figure is killed, descends into the realm of death, and is then resurrected to a new, eternal life, thereby conquering death for all who believe in him. For those who see direct influence, this is the most significant piece of evidence. They argue that the concept of a resurrected Savior was not a brand new invention in first-century Judea, but an idea that had been circulating in the Mediterranean spiritual marketplace for centuries, most powerfully in the mysteries of Isis. The Apostle Paul, they note, was a well-traveled man of the Roman world. It is conceivable that he and other early Christian missionaries would have encountered these ideas and framed the story of Jesus in a way that would resonate deeply with pagan audiences already longing for a God who could offer victory over the grave. The counter-argument from many historians and theologians is that the differences here are far more important than the similarities. They emphasize that the resurrection of Osiris is fundamentally different from that of Christ. Osiris is resurrected to a static, underworld existence. He does not return to earth in a glorified physical body. Jesus' resurrection, as described in the New Testament, is a bodily, physical return to life, culminating in his ascension into heaven. Furthermore, Christian scholars insist on the historical nature of Jesus' resurrection, claiming it as a unique, one-time event in history, not a mythical, cyclical story like that of Osiris, which was reenacted annually. They argue that the Jewish tradition, from which Christianity directly sprang, already contained seeds of resurrection theology, as seen in the Book of Daniel and other Second Temple period texts. From this perspective, the similarity is superficial, and the Christian belief in resurrection developed primarily from its own Jewish roots, not from pagan imitation. The debate often hinges on this very point. Is the story of Jesus a historical truth that accidentally resembles pagan myths? Or was it consciously or unconsciously shaped by the prevailing religious ideas of the time to communicate its message more effectively? Even the practical elements of ritual show intriguing points of comparison. In the daily worship at an Iseum, the use of sacred water for purification was absolutely central. The Nile River was considered the blood of Osiris, a divine, life-giving fluid. Devotees would use water from special temple cisterns, believed to be ritually aligned with the Nile, for sprinkling, libations, and ceremonial washing to achieve spiritual purity before approaching the goddess. This practice of ritual purification with water was a cornerstone of the cult. Now, consider the rapid development of baptism in early Christianity. While it has its origins in Jewish ritual washings, the Christian practice of baptism as a one-time initiation rite that cleansed sin and granted spiritual rebirth bears a functional resemblance to the purificatory rites of Isis. Both used water as a tangible agent of spiritual transition. Similarly, some have drawn a connection between the lustral water in the Iseum cult and the use of holy water in some Christian traditions. Another potential parallel lies in the concept of a shared, sacred meal. Some evidence suggests that Isiac initiates may have participated in a communal meal, perhaps consuming sacred cakes or other foods as part of their fellowship. This inevitably invites comparison with the Christian Eucharist, the ritual consumption of bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. While the theological meanings are vastly different, the external form, a communal ritual meal that strengthens the bonds of the faithful and connects them to the divine, is another point of structural similarity that has fueled the debate. So, how do we make sense of all this evidence? The most nuanced and widely accepted scholarly position today is not one of direct, conscious copying, but of a phenomenon known as syncretism or cultural osmosis. The Roman world of the first few centuries was a massive melting pot of ideas. Missionaries, merchants, and soldiers carried religious concepts across the empire, and these ideas mingled in the air. It is highly unlikely that the early church fathers sat down and decided to plagiarize the cult of Isis. Rather, as Christianity moved out of its exclusively Jewish context and into the wider Greco-Roman world, its leaders naturally used language, symbols, and conceptual frameworks that their audience would already understand. The powerful image of a mother and child, the profound hope for a savior who defeats death, the use of water for spiritual cleansing, these were religious idioms that were already deeply embedded in the Mediterranean mindset. Christianity, in articulating its own unique, and from its perspective, historically true message, adopted and adapted these existing idioms to express its revolutionary claims. The story of Jesus was, for Christians, the ultimate fulfillment of all the fragmented longings and partial truths found in the pagan world. The image of Mary didn't copy Isis. It fulfilled and transfigured the ancient human yearning for a compassionate mother goddess. The resurrection of Christ didn't mimic the myth of Osiris. It was presented as the historical reality to which all such myths were merely a dim, foreshadowing precursor. In the end, the story of Isis and early Christianity is less about one faith stealing from the other, and more about a timeless human quest for salvation finding expression through different, yet sometimes hauntingly familiar, paths. The echoes we hear between them are not necessarily evidence of borrowing, but a testament to the universal and enduring human desire for a loving protector, a victorious savior, and the hope that death is not the final word. Yet even as her last temples fell silent, and the sands of time drifted over her memory, the story of Isis was far from over. 1,000 years after the edicts of Theodosius, in the bustling city-states of 14th and 15th century Italy, a remarkable revolution was underway, the Renaissance. This great rebirth was not merely an artistic movement. It was a profound shift in consciousness, a passionate looking backward to the classical world of Greece and Rome for inspiration. And as scholars, artists, and wealthy patrons began to feverishly unearth and translate long-lost Latin and Greek texts, they kept stumbling upon a name that echoed through the ancient world: Isis. In the pages of the Roman historian Plutarch, they found his entire treatise on Isis and Osiris, a detailed and philosophical exploration of her mysteries. In the works of Appius, they read The Golden Ass, with its stunningly vivid account of her initiation rite. These texts were like lightning bolts, illuminating a forgotten spiritual landscape. Suddenly, the European intelligentsia discovered that the austere Romans they so admired had also been captivated by a powerful Egyptian mother goddess, a figure of immense wisdom and cosmic authority. This wasn't just an academic curiosity. It was the rediscovery of a lost archetype, a divine feminine principle that had been largely suppressed within the dominant religious framework of medieval Europe. The Renaissance mind, hungry for new old knowledge, eagerly reached out to embrace her. This intellectual rediscovery was powerfully amplified by a new, tangible connection to the physical past, the emerging field of archaeology. The Renaissance papacy, in its efforts to rebuild Rome as the glorious capital of Christendom, became an unlikely patron of excavation. As workers dug foundations for new churches and palaces, they began to uncover magnificent statues, intricate frescoes, and inscribed obelisks, many of them bearing the unmistakable iconography of Isis. The most spectacular finds came from the ruins of the Roman Iseum, the very temples that had been suppressed centuries before. A stunning marble statue of Isis would be pulled from the earth, her serene face and throne-shaped crown astonishing the artists who saw it. The great obelisks that Domitian had erected in the Iseum Campense were rediscovered, standing half buried in the soil of the Campus Martius. For the first time in a millennium, Europeans could look upon the actual likeness of the goddess, not as a demonic idol described by Christian polemicists, but as a breathtaking work of classical art. These discoveries created a fascinating tension. How could a culture that produced such sublime beauty also worship a so-called false god? The solution for many Renaissance humanists was to reinterpret Isis not as a theological rival to Christianity, but as a philosophical and artistic allegory. She became a symbol of something else entirely, the hidden wisdom of antiquity. This allegorical interpretation found its most brilliant and influential expression in the Renaissance obsession with hieroglyphics. When artists and scholars examined the rediscovered Egyptian obelisks or Roman sculptures covered in the strange pictorial script, they believed they were looking at a lost language of perfect wisdom. They were convinced that the ancient Egyptian priests, whom they revered as founts of primordial knowledge, had encoded the secrets of the universe, the laws of nature, the mysteries of God, and the principles of morality into these elegant symbols. And since Isis was, according to the very texts they were reading, the greatest magician and the mistress of all words of power, she was naturally seen as the guardian and source of this sacred, hidden language. This idea was powerfully popularized by a mysterious book known as the Hypnerotomachia Polyphili, or The Strife of Love in a Dream, published in Venice in 1499. This bizarre and lavishly illustrated romance novel follows a lover through a dreamscape filled with Egyptian-style ruins and obelisks covered in hieroglyphs. Throughout his journey, the figure of Isis appears repeatedly as a supreme goddess of nature and arcane knowledge. The book was a massive success among the educated elite, and it cemented in the European imagination the direct connection between Isis, ancient Egypt, and a secret symbolic wisdom that predated and perhaps even surpassed that of the Bible. It was within this heady atmosphere of esoteric discovery that artists began to reintroduce the goddess into the visual language of the West, though often in a cleverly disguised form. They could not openly paint a pagan deity for a church altarpiece, so they performed a kind of artistic alchemy, embedding her imagery into mythological and even Christian contexts. The great Sandro Botticelli, in his iconic painting, Primavera, captures the essence of this covert revival. The central figure of the work is a graceful, floral-adorned woman whom art historians traditionally identify as the goddess Venus. But look closer. Her pose, her flowing gown, and the gentle generative aura she projects are deeply evocative of the Isis, Venus syncretic statues unearthed from Roman soil. Botticelli, who was part of a Florentine circle, deeply interested in Platonic philosophy and ancient mysteries, was likely channeling the Renaissance conception of Isis as the animating soul of the natural world, the force behind the springtime renewal depicted in the painting. She is not named, but her presence is felt. Similarly, in his Birth of Venus, the goddess standing on the seashell, born from the foam, carries the same universal, life-giving energy that the Renaissance associated with the Egyptian mother. These were not mere copies of classical art. They were reinventions, using the newly recovered form of the classical goddess to express a new, humanistic ideal of beauty, nature, and divine wisdom that felt both ancient and thrillingly modern. Beyond the canvas, the figure of Isis captured the imagination of philosophers and esoteric thinkers who saw in her the perfect symbol for their own quests. For the intellectuals of the Renaissance, nature was no longer a mere creation of God. It was a vast, complex book written by the divine, filled with secrets waiting to be deciphered. Isis, described in the ancient hymns as the queen of the rivers and the winds and the sea, and the inventress of languages and writing, was reimagined as Isis the Mysterious, the personification of nature itself. Her veil became a powerful metaphor. In a famous allegory that would echo through the next 5 centuries, nature was depicted as the goddess Isis wearing a shimmering, impenetrable veil. The role of the natural philosopher, the alchemist, and the magus was to lift that veil, to peer beneath the surface of appearances and uncover the hidden laws and forces that govern the cosmos. This was not heresy. It was a sacred scientific endeavor. To study nature was to worship God by understanding his most intricate handiwork, and Isis was the sublime face of that handiwork. This idea provided a spiritual foundation for the early scientific revolution, inspiring figures from Paracelsus, who sought the healing secrets of nature, to the astronomers who charted the heavens, all seen as attempts to lift the veil of the celestial Isis. It was this philosophical current that flowed directly into the secret societies and occult traditions that began to flourish from the 16th century onward, laying the foundation for her modern esoteric legacy. Groups like the Rosicrucians, and later the Freemasons, who saw themselves as the inheritors of an ancient and universal wisdom tradition, eagerly adopted Isis into their symbolic systems. In their elaborate initiation rites and lodge decorations, Egyptian motifs, temples, obelisks, and of course, the veiled Isis became central. For them, Egypt was not a geographic location but a state of mind, the legendary source of all esoteric knowledge. Isis, as the goddess who resurrected Osiris using secret words and magical formulae, was the ultimate archetype of the master initiator, the one who holds the keys to life, death, and spiritual regeneration. When a Masonic candidate underwent his initiation, he was, in a symbolic sense, reenacting the journey of Lucius in The Golden Ass, or the Trials of Osiris, moving from a state of ignorance, spiritual death, to a state of enlightenment, rebirth. The rituals were not worship of Isis in a pagan sense, but a use of her powerful myth as a psychological and spiritual blueprint for personal transformation. In this way, the goddess who once offered salvation to the masses of Rome was transformed into a secret symbol for the inner enlightenment of a select few, ensuring that her legacy would continue to pulse beneath the surface of Western culture, waiting for its next moment of revelation. This journey of esoteric rediscovery did not end in the Renaissance libraries or Masonic lodges. It was merely the prelude to a full-blown modern revival that would see the goddess Isis step out of the symbolic shadows and back into active worship. The bridge between the philosophical allegories of the 18th century and the living spiritual practices of today was built by a series of revolutionary thinkers and secretive magical orders who dared to treat her not just as a metaphor, but as a tangible, potent spiritual force. One of the most pivotal yet tragic figures in this transition was the Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno. In the late 16th century, long before the widespread acceptance of such ideas, Bruno was already envisioning a universe animated by a single, divine soul. And he saw in the religion of ancient Egypt the purest expression of this cosmic truth. For Bruno, the countless deities of the Egyptian pantheon were not childish superstitions but profound, magical symbols, different faces of the one divine principle, used by the ancient priests to manipulate the very fabric of reality. He placed Isis at the very center of this system, seeing her as a supreme cosmic mother and a master of the divine art of memory and magic. His writings, which defiantly challenged the Church's authority and championed Hermetic philosophy, ultimately led him to be burned at the stake for heresy. Yet his ideas refused to die. They became a foundational spark for the modern occult, transmitting the concept of a universal, magical religion rooted in Egyptian wisdom into the European underground, ensuring that the flame of Isis, though suppressed, would never be fully extinguished. This hidden current of Egyptian esotericism surged into the mainstream of the Western occult tradition with the founding of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn in late 19th century England. The Golden Dawn was not a mere philosophical club. It was a comprehensive school of practical magic, and its entire system was steeped in the symbolism of ancient Egypt, with Isis occupying a throne of supreme importance. The order's initiates believed they were reconstructing the very mysteries practiced in the temples of the Nile, and they developed an elaborate series of graded rituals designed to purify the soul and awaken latent psychic powers. In these rituals, the imagery of Isis was everywhere. Aspirants might undertake a visionary journey symbolizing the death of Osiris, identifying with the dismembered god in order to achieve a higher state of consciousness. They learned to visualize the Egyptian gods, to use the symbolic tools of the thurible and the lotus wand, and to invoke the powers of the elements through the divine names of the Iseum pantheon. For a Golden Dawn magician, Isis was not a passive symbol of nature. She was the active, powerful goddess of 1,000 names, the supreme magician whose formulae could be used to achieve spiritual illumination and wield influence over the visible and invisible world. The order's most famous members, like the poet W.B. Yeats and the controversial magician Aleister Crowley, absorbed this Iseum current deeply. Crowley, in particular, would later integrate her into his own system of the lemma, often identifying the divine feminine principle, or Babylon, with the power and majesty of the Egyptian goddess. The Golden Dawn effectively systematized and operationalized the Renaissance vision of Isis, transforming her from an abstract allegory into the central figure of a working, initiatory magic that continues to influence Western esotericism to this day. The most profound transformation, however, occurred not in the secret vaults of magical orders, but in the broader cultural and spiritual upheaval of the 20th century. The rise of modern feminism, the environmental movement, and a growing disillusionment with patriarchal religions created a fertile ground for the re-emergence of the divine feminine. It was within this context that the goddess spirituality movement was born, and Isis found a new home, not as a symbol in a complex ritual, but as a living, breathing deity accessible to everyone. This modern paganism, or neo-paganism, represents a dramatic democratization of her worship. Where the ancient cult had its structured priesthood and the Golden Dawn its secret initiations, today's devotees often connect with Isis directly, in their own homes and in nature, seeing her as an intimate, personal goddess. The internet has become a global temple, where solitary practitioners from every corner of the world can share prayers, rituals, and experiences, forming a decentralized but vibrant community of devotion that would have been unimaginable just a few decades ago. In these modern practices, the ancient titles of the goddess have taken on powerful new meanings. Isis is revered as the ultimate expression of the divine feminine, a balancing force to centuries of male-dominated divinity. She is celebrated as the goddess of life, Her connection to the Nile's fertility, now interpreted as a mandate for ecological consciousness, and a celebration of the sacredness of the entire natural world. She is invoked as the Great Mother, a comforter and protector, but also as the sorceress, empowering individuals to take control of their own destinies through magical practice and personal will. Her mythology provides a powerful framework for understanding human experience. Her grief for Osiris resonates with anyone who has suffered loss, while her triumphant resurrection of him offers a timeless metaphor for healing, recovery, and the ability to reassemble one's own life after it has been shattered by tragedy. A modern ritual might be as simple as lighting a candle on a home altar adorned with a statue of Isis, offering her a libation of milk or water, and speaking a prayer from the heart for strength or guidance. Another might involve a group gathering under the full moon, chanting her name and shaking the sistrum, feeling her presence in the shared energy of the circle. For these practitioners, the goddess is not a historical relic. She is a present and active source of strength, wisdom, and magical power. Her ancient promise of personal salvation renewed for a contemporary world. The secret history of her cult, once buried under the ashes of Vesuvius and the decrees of emperors, is now an open book, and a new generation of worshippers is writing its next chapter, proving that the call of the goddess with 10,000 names is as compelling today as it was on the cobbled streets of ancient Rome. But beyond the grand narratives and architectural marvels, the true intimacy of a follower's relationship with the goddess was often expressed through the small, sacred objects they held in their hands. These were not mere props. They were potent conduits of divine energy, each one a key designed to unlock a specific aspect of Isis's power. 3 such objects stand out for their enduring resonance: the sistrum, the situla, and the knot of Isis. To understand these symbols is to hear the very soundtrack of the cult, to feel the purifying touch of its rituals, and to grasp the magical safeguards that protected its believers. The most iconic sound in the ancient world, at least for anyone near an Iseum, was the distinctive jingle of the sistrum. This was no ordinary rattle. It was a sacred percussion instrument, typically made of bronze, with a handle and a U-shaped frame. Metal rods were threaded through holes in the frame, with loose discs that would slide and clash when the instrument was shaken. The sound it produced was a rhythmic, metallic shimmer, a sound that ancient writers described as both joyous and haunting. But its purpose was far greater than creating ambience. The shaking of the sistrum was believed to perform a vital cosmic function. It summoned the presence of the goddess, and just as importantly, it drove away chaotic and malevolent forces. Think of it as a spiritual tool for tuning the atmosphere, clearing the air of negative energies to make a space fit for divine communion. The sound itself was thought to mimic the rustling of reeds along the banks of the Nile, the sacred river that was the source of all life in Egypt, thus connecting every ritual, no matter how far from Egypt it was performed, back to the goddess's primordial home. Priests and priestesses would shake the sistrum vigorously during processions and ceremonies, its rhythmic chatter cutting through the silence, focusing the minds of the worshippers, and creating a sonic barrier against disorder. Its use was so integral that to be a devotee of Isis was, in a very real sense, to be a person who moved through the world to the sacred rhythm of the sistrum's call. If the sistrum purified the air for the goddess's arrival, the situla provided the tangible, life-giving element that completed the sacred environment. A situla was a small, bucket-like vessel, often made of precious metal like silver or gold for temple use, or bronze and pottery for personal devotion. Its singular purpose was to hold and dispense sacred water. This was not just any water. It was water that had been ritually consecrated, often understood to be either actual Nile water imported at great cost or local water that had been magically aligned with the life-giving properties of the Nile. In the myth, the Nile was believed to be formed from the tears of Isis as she mourned for Osiris, and the river's annual flood was his resurrective power made manifest. Therefore, water from the Nile was considered the blood of Osiris, a fluid brimming with chaotic potential and regenerative power. During rituals, a priest would use the situla to sprinkle this holy water over the cult statue, the altar, and the congregation. This act was a direct bestowal of the goddess's blessings, a symbolic anointing with the very essence of life, fertility, and resurrection. The libation poured from the situla connected the worshipper to the core promise of the faith. Just as the Nile's waters brought life to the parched desert, so too could the grace of Isis bring spiritual life and renewal to the human soul. The simple act of being touched by these droplets was a physical participation in the mystery of death and rebirth. Perhaps the most personal and magical of all these symbols was the Tayet, a powerful amulet known to the Romans as the knot of Isis. Shaped like a looped sash with pendant ends, it strongly resembles the ankh, the Egyptian symbol for life, but with its arms folded downward, often crafted from red jasper, carnelian, or red glass colors symbolizing the blood of Isis and the potent force of life. The Tayet was a universal emblem of protection. Its meaning was multi-layered and profoundly deep. Most directly, it was associated with the girdle or the blood of Isis, and its magical properties were connected to the incantations she used to resurrect Osiris. To wear or carry a tie, it was to wrap oneself in the protective, magical energy of the goddess herself. It was a shield against all forms of harm, from physical illness and accidents to spiritual corruption and the evil eye. But its power went beyond simple defense. The knot is a symbol of binding and connection. The knot of Isis was believed to secure the blessings of the goddess, to bind her protective power directly to the wearer, and to connect the individual's fate to the divine order she represented. For this reason, Tayet amulets were commonly placed on mummies in Egypt to ensure the deceased's safe passage and resurrection in the afterlife, a practice that highlights its ultimate function, to secure the soul against the finality of death, binding it to the eternal cycle of rebirth. In the daily life of a Roman devotee, a small Tayet amulet might be worn as a pendant, sewn into clothing, or placed in a home to serve as a constant, silent guardian, a miniature monument to the magical prowess of the supreme sorceress. What is truly remarkable is that these ancient symbols have not been consigned to the glass cases of museums alone. They have been resurrected and given new life within modern spiritual practices. In contemporary pagan and esoteric traditions, the sistrum is once again heard. Practitioners use it in rituals dedicated to Isis or other Egyptian deities, its familiar jingle once again employed to clear sacred space, raise vibrational energy, and honor the goddess. While modern versions might be made from different materials, their purpose remains strikingly faithful to the ancient one: to create a sound that is both an invocation and a purification. The symbolic power of water, so central to the situla, is also a cornerstone of modern neopaganism. While a formal silver situla might be a rare artifact, any beautifully crafted cup or bowl can serve the same purpose: to hold water that has been consecrated to the goddess. This water is used to bless ritual circles, tools, and participants, maintaining that direct, tangible link between the elemental power of water and the divine grace of Isis. The act remains a sacred offering, a means of channeling her nourishing and regenerative energy into a ritual space. The knot of Isis, however, has experienced perhaps the most widespread revival, transcending its specifically Egyptian context to become a more general symbol of magical protection and connection to the divine feminine. You will find it on contemporary jewelry, in tattoo art, and etched onto magical tools. For a modern practitioner, wearing a tie, it is a declaration of spiritual identity, a way of carrying the protective and magical essence of the great goddess into everyday life. It serves as a reminder of one's own inner strength, and the ability to bind together the fragments of one's life into a cohesive, protected whole, much as Isis reassembled Osiris. It is a symbol of resilience, magical sovereignty, and the enduring power of the feminine to create, protect, and restore. These objects, therefore, are far more than archaeological curiosities. They are a living lexicon. The sistrum gives the cult its voice, the situla its essential, life-giving element, and the knot of Isis its tangible, protective magic. Together they form a symbolic toolkit that has allowed the devotion to this powerful goddess to resonate across 2 millennia, proving that the most enduring forms of faith are those that you can not only believe in, but also hear, touch, and hold in your hand. And so we reach the end of our journey, a story that began with the rhythmic whisper of the sistrum in a forbidden Roman backstreet, and concludes with the goddess's enduring echo across 2,000 years. The cult of Isis achieved what few spiritual movements ever have. It conquered its conquerors. It infiltrated the heart of a vast empire not with legions, but with an irresistible promise of personal salvation, community, and triumph over death. From its humble beginnings as a comfort for the marginalized and the enslaved, it weathered decades of brutal state persecution, its temples torn down and its altars smashed, only to rise again and again from the ashes, its appeal only strengthened by its forbidden status. In a stunning reversal of fortune, it then captivated the very emperors who had once sought to eradicate it, finding patrons in figures as diverse as the pragmatic Vespasian, the grandiose Domitian, and the notorious Commodus, who saw in its mysteries a source of divine legitimacy and personal power. This was not a faith that demanded the abandonment of the world, but one that offered to transform it, providing a sacred space where women could wield unprecedented authority, where social hierarchies were softened by shared devotion, and where the terrifying finality of the Roman underworld was replaced by the sun-drenched hope of the Field of Reeds. Its legacy, however, did not vanish with the fall of Rome. Suppressed by the rise of monolithic Christianity, the goddess merely went underground, her symbols and myths preserved by Renaissance humanists, who saw in her a personification of nature's secret wisdom, by occult philosophers like Giordano Bruno, who died for his belief in her cosmic truth, and by secret societies like the Golden Dawn, who operationalized her rituals for spiritual awakening. Today, in the global, decentralized networks of modern paganism and goddess spirituality, Isis lives anew, no longer a secret to be kept, but a living presence for a new generation seeking connection, empowerment, and the timeless magic of the divine feminine. Her story is a powerful testament to the fact that the most profound revolutions are often not of politics or sword, but of the human spirit. We have walked through the Grand Iseum and knelt in the hidden initiation chambers, but the conversation does not end here. We want to hear from you, of all the facets of this incredible secret history, the political intrigue, the empowering role of women, the profound mystery rites, or her lasting esoteric legacy, which aspect captivated your imagination the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of history, be sure to subscribe. There are countless more hidden stories waiting to be uncovered, and we